The call came on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day that had no drama in it, no wait, no particular promise. Nora Callahan was standing in the break room of the dry cleaning shop where she worked, eating half a sandwich she had packed that morning because buying lunch was no longer something she allowed herself to do. The fluorescent light above the coffee machine had been flickering for 3 weeks, and nobody had fixed it yet. That small, persistent malfunction felt, on most days, like a metaphor for everything. She was 34 years old. She had a daughter named Lily who was 6.5 and who asked questions the way other children breathe constantly, naturally, without any awareness that some questions didn't have good answers. She had a rented apartment with a bathroom faucet that dripped and a radiator that clanged through the night, and a landlord who responded to messages in the same way the government responded to small problems slowly, reluctantly, and only when the situation had grown beyond comfortable ignoring. She had, in short, exactly the life that happens when you do your best and the world moves at a different speed than you do. The call was from a lawyer she had never spoken to before. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he had a voice like old furniture, solid, a little dusty, entirely without warmth. He informed her, in the careful language of a man accustomed to delivering news that could go either way, that she had been named in the estate of her great-uncle Raymond Callahan, deceased, who had owned a piece of property in the rural outskirts of Harlow County, and who had, apparently, thought of Nora at the very end of his long and largely solitary life. Nora did not remember Raymond Callahan clearly. She remembered a tall, quiet man who had come to her grandmother's house once or twice when she was small. He had smelled of wood smoke and engine oil and had said very little, watching everything with the patient attention of someone who had learned long ago that listening was more useful than speaking. He had pressed a $5 bill in her hand on one of those visits and told her to buy herself something she actually wanted, not something useful. She had bought a small painted horse from a roadside stand and kept it on her windowsill for years. That was the sum of her inheritance from Raymond Callahan: a memory, a painted horse, and now, apparently, a farmhouse. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Gerald Marsh sent the documents the following morning. Nora read them at the kitchen table after Lily had gone to school, her coffee going cold beside her while she worked through the language slowly and carefully. The property was described as a single-story wood-frame farmhouse situated on approximately 4 acres, with a detached outbuilding and a well. It had been constructed in the early part of the previous century and had not been significantly updated since. The most recent county assessment had placed its value at just under $60,000, and that number, Nora suspected, was the result of generosity rather than accuracy. She looked at the photographs Gerald Marsh had attached to his email and understood immediately why the number felt high. The farmhouse was not simply old. It was exhausted. The porch had developed a lean that suggested the post beneath it had given up trying. Several of the exterior boards had warped and darkened, and the paint, whatever color it had once been, had retreated so thoroughly that the wood beneath had gone gray and bare. The roof showed patches where shingles had surrendered to weather and gone wherever shingles go. The windows were small and filmed with the kind of grime that accumulates not over weeks or months, but over years of sustained neglect. The outbuilding in the background of one photograph was a generous word for what appeared to be a structure in active negotiation with gravity. Nora set her phone down and looked at the wall of her apartment for a long moment. She was not a person given to fantasy. She had learned, through a series of educational disappointments, that hope was most useful when it was attached to something concrete. When her ex-husband had left 4 years ago, not with cruelty exactly, but with a kind of exhausted finality that was almost worse, she had not allowed herself to fall apart for long. There was Lily to consider, and Lily required breakfast and story time and someone who showed up consistently, which had turned out to be a more complicated achievement than it sounded. She had gone back to work within a week. She had figured out the childcare. She had restructured their lives around what was real and available. And she had done it without drama or complaint, because drama and complaint were luxuries that require an audience, and Nora's audience was 6 years old and needed a stable mother more than a sympathetic one. But the farmhouse was real. It existed, and whatever its current condition, it was hers. She called Gerald Marsh back that same afternoon and asked the questions that mattered. Were there liens on the property? No. Was the title clean? Yes. Were there any outstanding taxes? A small amount, manageable. What was required of her to take possession? A signature, a short trip to the county clerk's office, and the presence of 2 forms of government identification. She drove out to Harlow County on a Saturday, leaving Lily with her neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, who was 71 and treated Lily with the particular combination of indulgence and affection that only grandmotherly neighbors managed without being asked. The drive took just over 2 hours, through highway miles that gradually became county road miles that gradually became the kind of road that had no lines painted on it, and probably hadn't for some time. Harlow County was the sort of place that the word quiet failed to fully capture. It was not merely quiet the way a library or an early morning was quiet. It was quiet the way that places are when they have accepted that the busy world has moved elsewhere and made their peace with it. The fields along the road were wide and mostly empty at this time of year, the soil dark and winter-heavy, dotted here and there with old fence lines and the occasional stand of bare trees. There were farmhouses at long intervals, most of them occupied and tended, their mailboxes upright and their driveways plowed. And then there was Raymond Callahan's house. She almost missed the driveway because it was marked only by 2 stones that had once flanked a gate, the gate itself long since gone. The driveway was gravel, or had been, the stones now mostly swallowed by years of encroaching grass. Nora drove slowly, the rental car's undercarriage scraping once against a ridge of frozen ground, and came to a stop in front of the house. Up close, it was even more itself than the photographs had suggested. The porch lean she had noted in the image was more pronounced in person, the boards bowing under the accumulated weight of time and weather. The front door was painted a dark green that had oxidized to something closer to black in places, and the small window beside it was cracked along one corner in a diagonal line that had been there long enough to gather its own layer of grime. 2 of the porch steps had been replaced. At some point the wood was lighter, but the third had simply been removed and not replaced at all, leaving a gap that required a small hop to navigate. Nora stood in the cold air and looked at it for a while. She was not overwhelmed. She had not expected to be. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complicated recognition, perhaps, that this place was exactly as difficult as it appeared, and that the question of what to do with it was not one she was going to answer standing in a cold driveway. She went inside. The interior smelled of old wood and the particular mustiness of a space that had been closed for a long time. The air inside was only marginally warmer than the air outside. The front room was bare, its walls pale where pictures had once hung, the floor uneven in ways that she could feel through the soles of her boots. A stone fireplace occupied one wall, its hearth full of ash that no one had cleared. The kitchen beyond it was small and functional, its fixtures old enough to belong to a different era of domestic expectation. There was a gas range that looked like it might still work. There was a sink with a single tap. There was a window above the sink that looked out over the back of the property, and through the glass, Nora could see the wide pale sky over the empty fields. She walked through each room slowly. There were 3 of them beyond the front room, a kitchen, a room that had served as a bedroom, and a smaller room off the back hallway whose original purpose she couldn't quite determine. It was not large enough to be a second bedroom. It was not positioned correctly to be a bathroom. It had a single high window and a floor that felt different underfoot than the rest of the house, denser, more solid, less prone to the subtle give that old wooden floors develop over time. She stood in that small room for a moment, looking at the floor, and then moved on. The outbuilding she had seen in the photograph was at the back of the property, accessible through a door in the kitchen that led to a short covered walkway. The building was smaller than it had looked in the image, and in worse repair 2 of its walls had developed visible gaps where boards had warped apart, and the interior smelled strongly of rust and old gasoline. There were remnants of agricultural equipment, a partial harness, a manual seed press of some kind, objects whose precise purposes had become obscure through decades of disuse. She photographed everything. She took her time. She walked the 4 acres of the property as far as the frozen ground and the dead brush at the edges allowed, noting the old fence lines, a dry stream bed along the eastern boundary, a stand of trees at the north end that looked like it had been planted deliberately, their spacing too regular to be accidental. By the time she drove back toward the highway, the light had already begun to flatten into the gray of late afternoon. She had made no decisions. She had formed no plans. But something had shifted slightly in her thinking, in the way that things shift when the abstract becomes concrete, and what seemed like a complication begins, very slowly, to look like a possibility. She did not tell many people about the property at first. That was partly caution and partly an awareness, developed over years of being a practical person in an impractical world, that people's reactions to news were often more complicated than the news itself. She told Mrs. Pacheco, who responded with the warm enthusiasm of someone who had always believed that Nora deserved better things and was pleased to see the universe beginning to agree. She told her coworker Dana at the dry cleaning shop, who asked immediately and with genuine curiosity what the house was worth and whether Nora planned to sell it. She told her sister Rachel, who lived 4 states away and called back 40 minutes later with a list of concerns that she had clearly organized in her head before dialing. Rachel was 2 years older than Nora and operated, always from a position of well-intentioned alarm. She asked about the structural integrity. She asked about the cost of repairs. She asked whether Nora had had it inspected and, when Nora said not yet, made a sound that communicated several feelings simultaneously without requiring words to do so. A $60,000 property that needs work is not $60,000, Rachel said. It's whatever $60,000 minus the work comes to, which in these cases is usually much less than you'd think. Nora agreed that this was probably true. You should sell it as is, Rachel said. Get whatever you can get and put it towards something stable. Nora said she was still thinking about it. What she was thinking about, though she did not articulate this to Rachel, was not the market value of the property or the cost of its repairs. She was thinking about Lily, who had never had a backyard, who had spent her entire conscious life in a series of apartments where the outside world was accessed through a lobby and a heavy door and several flights of stairs. She was thinking about the 4 acres of Harlow County, which were not beautiful in any picturesque sense, but were real and large and empty in the specific way that gave a person room to think. She was thinking about the small room with the dense floor and the particular feeling of standing in a house that belonged to her, not to a landlord, not to a bank, not to anyone else. She had not had that feeling before. It was unfamiliar and slightly frightening, and also, underneath both of those things, quietly sustaining. A week after her first visit, she made a second trip. This time she brought Lily. She had not originally planned to bring her daughter on what was essentially a working trip, a walkthrough with a contractor friend who had agreed to give her an informal assessment in exchange for dinner. But Mrs. Pacheco had a doctor's appointment that she had rescheduled twice already, and there was no one else available, and Lily, when told they were driving to see a house in the country, had been so immediately and completely excited that Nora hadn't had the heart to find an alternative. Lily sat in the back seat of the car for the 2-hour drive and asked questions for approximately half of that time. Was the house big? Was it old? Did it have a garden? Did it have a fireplace? Were there any animals? Nora answered as accurately as she could. Medium. Yes, very. Not anymore. Yes. Unlikely. But possibly mice, which caused Lily to make a face and then immediately ask whether they could keep one. The contractor's name was Walt. He was a man in his late 50s who had spent his working life in buildings and had developed the particular habit of looking at walls and floors the way a doctor looked at a patient, with attention to what was visible and systematic suspicion of what wasn't. He walked through the house ahead of them, while Lily stayed close to Nora, unusually quiet, looking at everything with the careful attention of a child processing something new. Walt's assessment, delivered in the kitchen over coffee he had brought in a thermos, was honest and not entirely discouraging. The bones, he said, were good. The foundation was solid, better than it had any right to be, given the age of the house. The roof needed work, but it was patchable rather than replaceable. The electrical was outdated, but functional enough to pass a safety inspection with some targeted updates. The plumbing was old, but had been well maintained at some point in the past. The gas line to the range was sound. The cost to make the house livable, not perfect, not renovated, but safe and weathertight and functional, he estimated in a range that was still more than Nora had available, but not by as much as she had feared. She was quiet through most of this, doing the arithmetic in her head that she had been doing in various forms for 4 years. It was while Walt was walking her through the back hallway, pointing at a section of wall where moisture had once intruded and then apparently stopped, that Lily appeared in the doorway of the small room at the end of the corridor. She was standing very still, which was unusual for her. Her head was tilted the way it went when she was listening for something. "Mommy," she said, "the floor in here sounds different." Nora looked up from the wall Walt was examining. "What do you mean, different?" Lily demonstrated, pressing one foot down firmly on the hallway floor, then crossing into the small room and pressing down again in the same way. The sound was different, not dramatically, not in the way a loose board sounded, but in the deeper, fuller way that something solid sounded when it was more solid than what surrounded it. Walt crossed the hall and stood in the room, pressing his boot down slowly in several places. He crouched and knocked on the floor with his knuckle, moved a foot to the left, and knocked again. He looked up at Nora with an expression that was professionally neutral, but carried something underneath it. "Old-growth wood," he said after a moment. "Dense, tight grain. This floor is older than the rest of the house, or it came from somewhere older. Not unusual in houses like this. You use what you have." He stood and moved on to the next thing on his list. Nora watched him go, then looked down at the floor of the small room. Lily was still standing in it, looking at the boards with the focused expression of a child who has identified something and is now waiting for the adults to catch up. "Mommy," Lily said, "there's something under the floor." "There's something under every floor, sweetheart," Nora said. "It's called the ground." Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "No," she said, in the patient tone of someone correcting a misunderstanding. "Not like that. Something else." Nora reached out and took her daughter's hand and walked her back toward the kitchen, where Walt was finishing his notes and the thermos of coffee was still warm. She thought about what Lily had said on the drive home, in the intermittent way that thoughts return when the mind has space between Lily's questions about the fireplace and her eventual fall into sleep somewhere on the highway miles, her cheek pressed against the car window. Children said things. Children heard things. Lily's ears were attuned to frequencies that adults had long since learned to filter out, and what sounded like insight was often just the particular sensitivity of a mind that had not yet decided what to ignore. Still, the floor had sounded different. Walt had noticed it too, even if his explanation was practical and certain. She filed it away the way she filed most things she couldn't immediately use in a back compartment of her attention. Not discarded, just set aside. The weeks that followed were the weeks of paperwork and phone calls, and the slow, grinding process of turning inherited property into lived possibility. She signed the documents at the county clerk's office. She opened a correspondence with Gerald Marsh about the estate's remaining details. She called the utility companies and learned what it would take to restore services that had lapsed. She looked at her bank account and her savings, a number that was real and honest, and not what she needed, but closer than nothing, and she began to make calculations. The people of her life had opinions. Her co-worker Dana thought Nora was being reckless, which she expressed with the particular energy of someone who was actually slightly jealous and channeling it into concern. "You can't just move to the middle of nowhere with a 6-year-old, Dana said during one of their lunch breaks. "What about Lily's school? What about your job? What about," she gestured vaguely, "everything?" Nora pointed out that Harlow County had schools, that the dry cleaning shop had not recently offered her a promotion, and that everything was a concept she was actively in the process of reconsidering. Dana looked at her for a long moment. "You've already decided," she said. Nora had. Her sister Rachel called twice more with updated concerns. The second call included a statistic she had read somewhere about rural property values declining in counties with shrinking populations. Nora listened to the statistic and thanked her sister for her research and did not change her plans. The man at the hardware store in Harlow County, whose name was Ed and who had been selling things to people fixing up old properties for 30 years, was more useful than anyone. He walked her through a prioritized list of repairs in the order they actually needed to happen, rather than the order that would have been most satisfying. He recommended a local roofer and a local electrician and told her which jobs she could do herself with patience and a willingness to watch tutorial videos. He did not ask her why she was doing this or suggest that she reconsider. He simply helped her with the thing she had decided to do, which was, in Nora's experience, rarer than it should have been. She moved in on a Friday in early spring, 5 months after Gerald Marsh's phone call. Her belongings fit into a rented van with room to spare, which said something about the life she was leaving and something about the one she was entering. Lily sat on top of one of the boxes in the back of the van for 20 minutes before Nora made her get into the proper seat and spent the drive asking whether they had arrived yet, with an enthusiasm that didn't diminish across 2 hours and 4 separate iterations of the question. The house was cold when they arrived. The furnace, which Walt had assessed as functional but reluctant, took 40 minutes to respond to Nora's encouragement and a YouTube tutorial about pilot lights. The kitchen faucet had developed a new drip in the months since her visit, joining the existing one in a small domestic chorus. 2 of the windows in the front room admitted a thin, cold draft that Nora located with a candle flame and marked with tape for later sealing. But the fireplace worked. She had had the chimney swept in advance, and the first fire she built in it that evening was real and warm and threw its light across the bare walls and the unpacked boxes in Lily's face, which was so completely absorbed in the sight of actual fire in an actual fireplace that she forgot, for several minutes, to ask questions. They ate dinner on the floor because the table was still in pieces. They slept in sleeping bags because the beds were still in boxes. In the morning, the light came through the windows at an angle that was different from any light that had come through any window in any of their previous apartments, because this light was coming through windows that stood in the middle of 4 acres, with no other building to interrupt or filter it, and it fell across the kitchen floor in a wide, clean band that Lily walked into and stood in with her arms out, her face turned up toward the ceiling. "I like this house," Lily announced. "Good," Nora said. "It likes us back," Lily said, which was the sort of thing Lily said with complete conviction and no awareness that it was not a factual statement. Nora looked at the light on the kitchen floor and at her daughter standing in it and did not disagree. The first month was the month of basic repairs and the development of new routines. Lily started at the county elementary school, which was smaller than her previous school and had a library with a comfortable rug and a music teacher who also taught art, which was somehow more than the larger school had managed. She came home with paint on her hands and strong opinions about books, and on the 3rd day, a new friend named Chloe, whose family had a dog and whose mother, Patrice, turned out to be a quiet and practical person who invited Nora for coffee and asked no unnecessary questions about why she had moved to Harlow County. Nora worked remotely, having arranged, in the months before the move, to shift her hours at the dry cleaning shop to a part-time, remote bookkeeping role. It was less money than before, but less money in a house she owned was different mathematics than less money in an apartment she rented. She supplemented with a couple of small freelance accounts she had built through an online platform, basic bookkeeping and receipt organization for small businesses whose owners were good at their work and bad at their paperwork. She repaired the porch in the 3rd week. She found that the posts beneath the lean were not rotted through, as she had feared, but only loosened at the base, and with Walt's phone guidance and several hours of effort and a great deal of specific language that she kept to a minimum volume, because Lily was playing in the yard, she got them back into position and the lean corrected. The porch, once level, felt like a different porch. She sat on it that evening with a glass of water and watched the light go out of the sky over the fields and felt something she had not felt in a long time, not happiness exactly, but its steadier and more reliable cousin, which is satisfaction. She was working on the electrical with the contracted help of a local man named Terry, who was methodical and clear about what he was doing, which Nora appreciated. They were working their way through the house room by room, updating the outlets and the box and the connections that had drifted out of code over decades of gentle inattention. When they reached the small room off the back hallway, Terry stopped in the doorway and looked at the floor the way Walt had, with professional attention to a material detail. "Old growth," he said. That's what the contractor said, too, Nora told him. Terry walked in and crouched and pressed his hand flat against the boards. Dense, he said. Tighter than what's out here. He knocked with his knuckle, moved a few feet, knocked again. He looked up at her. You feel the way it sounds different? My daughter noticed it the first time we came here. Terry stood and looked around the room again. This room's older than the house, he said. Or part of it is. You can see it in the ceiling. Look at the join. He pointed to where the ceiling of the small room met the ceiling of the hallway. The join was not quite flush. There was a slight differential, a difference in height and finish, visible only if you knew to look. Somebody built onto an existing structure, he said. This room, or what's under it, was already here. He moved on to the outlet work without further comment, in the focused way of a man who had learned to note unusual things and keep moving. But Nora stood in the doorway of the small room for a long moment after he went, looking at the floor. What's under it was already here. She did not do anything about it that day, or the next. There was too much immediate work, the kind of work that required attention and generated visible results. And she gave her attention there because she had learned, through years of practical experience, to address the concrete before the speculative. But she found herself returning to the small room in the margins of the day, in the early mornings before Lily woke, or in the evenings after her daughter had gone to sleep. Not to do anything, just to stand in it, to look at the floor, to notice what Lily had noticed and what Walt and Terry had confirmed. The density, the sound, the sense that something beneath these boards existed in a different register than the rest of the house. One evening, about 6 weeks after they had moved in, Lily followed her in. She stood beside Nora and looked at the floor with the same focused attention she had shown on the first visit, as if she had been waiting for Nora to be ready for this particular conversation. Mommy, she said, there's something under the floor. You've said that before, Nora said. I know, Lily said. It's still there. Nora looked at her daughter. 6.5 years old. 30 pounds of certainty in pink boots. What makes you think that? Nora asked. Lily considered this carefully, which was what she did when she was trying to find words for something she had identified through a means other than words. It sounds like a secret, she said. Nora sat down on the floor of the small room. The boards were cold and slightly rough under her palms. She pressed down and felt the density that Terry and Walt had described: solid, unyielding, dense beyond what age alone explained. She knocked on the floor. Then she moved a foot and knocked again. She moved again, knocked, and then she moved to a spot near the center of the room, knocked, and stopped. The sound was different there. Not different the way a hollow space sounded that would have been dramatic, immediately obvious. Different the way something sealed and engineered sounded when compared to something simply structural. A quieter difference. A smaller one. The kind you only heard if you were listening for it. She looked at Lily. Lily looked back at her with the expression of someone who had been waiting quite patiently. Okay, Nora said. I hear it. She got the small pry bar from the toolbox in the kitchen the next morning, after she had seen Lily off to school and sat with her coffee long enough to let the decision settle into certainty. She had not slept well, which was not because of anxiety exactly, but because her mind had been turning something over all night in the way that minds do, when they have identified something they cannot quite resolve. She went into the small room and stood over the spot she had marked in her memory the center, the place where the sound was different, and she crouched down and looked at the boards. They were laid the same as everywhere else in the room, edge to edge, with gaps between them that had closed over decades of the wood swelling and contracting with the seasons. But when she looked closely, she could see that the boards near the center of the room had seams that were subtly different from the boards at the edges, not in the wood itself, but in the way they had aged. The seams at the center were slightly tighter, slightly newer, as if they had been lifted and relayed at some point after the original installation. She pressed the flat edge of the pry bar into the seam. The wood resisted. She worked slowly, carefully, conscious of the need not to damage anything she could not replace, moving along the seam in small increments, easing rather than forcing. After several minutes, she felt something give, not dramatically, but perceptibly, a slight release of pressure that traveled through the bar and into her hands. She worked the bar along the seam another few inches and tried again. This time, the board lifted slightly at one end. Not by much. Half an inch, perhaps. But enough. Enough for a thin current of air to escape from beneath it. Nora sat back on her heels. The air was old. She could not have described it precisely. It was not unpleasant, not sharp, not the smell of decay or contamination. It was the smell of sealed space, of time preserved, of air that had been sitting still for longer than she had been alive. She sat with it for a moment. Then she went to get a flashlight. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The board came up cleanly once she had the angle right, and then the board beside it, and then two more, revealing a rectangular section of the floor approximately 3 feet by 4. The board set slightly differently from those around them, their end cuts precise, their edges fitted, as if they had been designed to be removable rather than permanent. Beneath them was darkness. And beneath the darkness, when she directed the flashlight downward, was a shaft. It was not a hole. It was not a collapsed section of subfloor or a crawlspace access. It was a shaft deliberately constructed, its walls lined with concrete that curved slightly outward at the base, smooth and dense, and clearly engineered. A ladder was set into one side, its rungs made of iron, darkened with age, but intact. The shaft descended perhaps 15 feet before it widened into something larger, something that the flashlight reached but could not fully illuminate. Nora sat at the edge of the opening for a long time. Long enough for the morning light to shift in the window. Long enough for a bird outside to start a conversation and finish it and move on. Long enough to feel the particular quality of the air rising from below, which was cool and still and ancient, carrying within it the scent of metal and paper and something else she could not identify, but which registered, somewhere below conscious thought, as significant. She was not afraid. She was also not reckless. She was a person who had spent 4 years making decisions that were careful rather than impulsive, and that habit did not leave her simply because the circumstances had become extraordinary. She replaced the boards. She locked the back door. She drove to the county library, which had internet faster than the farmhouse's connection, and she began to research. She did not search for treasure. That word didn't come to her, not yet. She searched for the history of the farmhouse, for Raymond Callahan's name in county records, for the history of the property's ownership going back as far as the records went. What she found was thorough, but ordinary ownership transfers, tax records, boundary surveys, and then, when she went further back before the Callahan family acquired in the 1950s, she found a name she did not recognize. Hargreave. The property had belonged, before its sale to the Callahans, to a man named Elias Hargreave, who had acquired it in the 1920s and held it until 1951. She found a brief mention of Hargreave in a digitized local newspaper archive, a business notice from 1931 referencing his involvement in several agricultural import concerns across the region. And then another mention, smaller, from 1942, which was different in tone, cautious, brief, and accompanied by language that suggested the concerns had been resolved without elaboration. She brought those documents home and set them on the kitchen table. Then she sat across from them, the way she sometimes sat across from a set of accounts that didn't quite balance, and she looked at them and thought. Raymond Callahan had owned this house for over 60 years without, as far as she could tell, ever telling anyone what was beneath the small room at the back of it. He had left it to Nora, not to anyone else, not to a historical society or a county trust, but to her specifically, a great niece he had barely known. He had pressed a $5 bill into the hands of a small girl and told her to buy something she actually wanted. She thought about that for a while. Then she called Walt. Walt arrived the next morning with a more serious flashlight than hers and a methodical attitude that she had come to deeply appreciate. She showed him the shaft without preamble. He looked down it for a long time, directed his light at the walls, at the ladder, at the space below that the light still could not fully reach. And then he looked at her with the expression of a man who was recalibrating several assumptions simultaneously. "How old is that concrete?" she asked. He crouched and looked at the upper lip of the shaft, where the concrete met the subfloor. He ran his thumb along it. "Pre-war," he said after a moment. "Maybe 1930s. The aggregate's consistent with that period. He looked at the ladder rungs. Iron, not steel. Same era. Is it safe to go down? He was quiet for a long moment. Structurally, probably. The concrete looked sound. He looked at her. But you don't know what the air's like down there. Or what you'll find. Can you get a gas monitor? He could. He went to his truck and came back with a small device that he lowered on a cable into the shaft and let sit for 10 minutes. The readings came back clear. Oxygen levels normal, no measurable toxic compounds. He looked at her. She looked at the shaft. I'll go first, he said. She did not argue. She watched him descend the iron ladder, his flashlight casting moving shadows against the concrete walls. She heard his boots find the bottom. She heard him exhale once slowly. And then she heard him say, in a voice that was absolutely controlled and carried beneath its control something she had never heard from him before, something that might have been awe. Nora, you need to come down here. She descended carefully, hand over hand on the iron rungs, the shaft cool around her and the old air rising to meet her as she went. The ladder was solid. The rungs were firm. And when her boots found the floor at the bottom, she turned, and she lifted her flashlight, and she understood immediately why Walt's voice had sounded the way it sounded. The space was vast. Not warehouse vast, not cathedral vast, but vast by every measure that mattered in the context of Farmhouse in Harlow County, a chamber that extended far beyond what the footprint of the small room above could have suggested, its ceiling arching in a smooth concrete curve that peaked perhaps 12 feet above the floor. The walls were smooth and unbroken. The floor was dry and clean, swept by no one, untouched for decades, yet free of the debris and water damage that should have accumulated over so much time. Along the walls, arranged in rows so orderly they looked almost ceremonial, were containers. Not boxes, not crates. Containers metal, reinforced, their surfaces darkened by age, but their construction clearly deliberate, clearly engineered for durability and for the specific purpose of protecting whatever lay within them over a long period of time. She counted them as her light moved across them. She lost count after 30. She stood in the middle of the chamber with the flashlight in her hand and the old air around her and the weight of the earth above, and she thought about the $5 bill and the painted horse and the long solitary life of a quiet man who had owned a farmhouse in Harlow County and known, all along, what was beneath the floor of the small room at the back of it. She thought about Lily, who was at school right now, learning about letter sounds and drawing pictures with a teacher who also taught music. She thought about the dripping faucet and the flickering light and the 4 years of arithmetic and the particular feeling of lying awake at 3 in the morning trying to make numbers do something they didn't want to do. And then she reached out and rested her hand on the nearest container, feeling the cold metal under her palm. And she said nothing at all because there were no words adequate to the moment, only the sound of old air moving and the solid weight of something real beneath her hand and the long, still patience of a secret that had been waiting for a very long time for the right person to come home. Walt did not say anything either, which was, in its own way, the most expressive thing she had ever seen him do. He stood a few feet behind her, his flashlight moving steadily from container to container, left to right along the wall, the way a person's eyes move across a page of text that they are reading very carefully and have decided not to rush. She could hear his breathing measured, deliberate, the breathing of a man who was keeping himself calm by main force of discipline. How many? She finally said. Still counting, he said. She began counting too, moving her own light along the rows. The containers varied in size. Some were approximately the dimensions of a large travel trunk. Others were smaller and stacked too high, and others still were narrow and tall like oversized document boxes, or the kind of container she had seen in photographs of military archives. All of them were sealed. All of them were constructed with the same deliberate durability heavy-gauge metal, reinforced at the corners, with locking mechanisms that were simple but solid. She counted 47. Walt counted 49. They walked the chamber together and settled on 48, attributing the discrepancy to the same 2 containers in the back corner that were partially obscured by the angle and the shadow. The chamber was not perfectly circular, it was closer to oval, widening toward the back and narrowing slightly at the far end, where the wall curved inward and a second, smaller door was set into the concrete. This door was not a shaft. It was a horizontal door, perhaps 4 feet tall and 2 wide, fitted into a steel frame that had been bolted into the concrete at some point after the chamber's construction. It was locked with a padlock that was newer than everything else in the room. Not dramatically newer, but noticeably in the way that something from the 1970s was noticeably different from something from the 1930s. Raymond Callahan had been in this room, had stood where she was standing, had touched where she was touching, and he had put a lock on that door, which meant he had known about the door and had made a decision about it. She pressed her palm against the cool metal surface of the door and said nothing. Walt was photographing the containers with his phone, moving methodically, keeping the light steady, documenting. He was, she understood, doing what he did in every situation where something needed to be handled. He was working. She appreciated that about him more in this moment than she ever had before. "I need to get Lily from school in 3 hours," she said. Her voice sounded almost normal. "Okay," Walt said. "And I need to think." "Okay," he said again. They went back up the ladder. She replaced the boards over the shaft opening, fitting them back into the seams as carefully as she could, though she was aware that they would never quite sit the same as they had before, that something about the precision of their placement had been altered by her removing them. She would need to address that. She added it to the list in the back of her mind, which had always been long and was now slightly longer. She drove to the county library again, not for the internet this time, but for the quiet, and for the library's single private study room, which she booked at the front desk for 2 hours with a library card she had gotten the previous month. She sat in a small room with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and she wrote down everything she knew, in the order she knew it, with dates where she had them. Elias Hargreave. The farmhouse acquired in the 1920s. The agricultural import concerns. The 1942 mention and its careful language. The sale to the Callahans in 1951. Raymond Callahan's decades of silent ownership. His decision, at the end of his life, to leave the property not to a historical organization or a government agency, but to his great-niece, who was 34 years old and had never had a backyard. She wrote, "He knew what was there. He chose me." She sat with that for a while. Then she wrote, "Why?" That question had several possible answers, and she found herself working through them with the same systematic attention she brought to a set of accounts that needed to be reconciled. The most charitable answer was that Raymond had trusted her in some specific way, had seen, in the brief encounters of her childhood, something that made him believe she would handle this appropriately, whatever appropriately meant for a discovery of this scale. The less comfortable answer was that he had chosen her precisely because she had no institutional connections, no relationship with any authority that might complicate the situation. A single mother with a 6-year-old and a bookkeeping practice was, in some practical sense, the least likely person to immediately involve people with agendas. She wrote, "He trusted me to be careful." And then, below that, "I need to be careful." The first thing she did when she got home with Lily that afternoon was call her sister Rachel. This surprised her even as she was doing it, because Rachel was not generally the person she called when she needed clear thinking. Rachel's default mode was alarm, which was useful sometimes and actively unhelpful at others. But what Rachel had beneath the alarm was a lawyer's mind. She had spent 15 years as a paralegal before leaving the profession to raise her own children, and she retained, from that time, a very clear understanding of how property, ownership, and discovery intersected with legal liability. She told Rachel everything. There was a long silence when she finished, long enough that Nora checked the phone screen to make sure the call was still connected. "Okay," Rachel said finally. "Don't touch anything. Don't open any of the containers. And you need to talk to a lawyer before you talk to anyone else." "I know," Nora said. "A good one. Not the estate lawyer. A property and salvage lawyer. Someone who knows about abandoned assets and historic preservation and all of that." "I know," Nora said again. "And Nora," Rachel paused. "You're sure about what you saw?" Nora looked across the kitchen at the doorway to the back hallway, beyond which lay the small room with its dense, old-growth floor. "Yes," she said. "I'm sure." Another silence. Then Rachel said, very quietly, something she rarely said. "I'm sorry I told you to sell it." Nora sat at the kitchen table after the call and listened to Lily moving around in the other room, building something with the blocks she had brought from the apartment and narrating it to herself in the way she did when she was absorbed, a running quiet commentary on the decision she was making and why. Nora could hear the particular satisfaction in her daughter's voice, the ease of a child who felt settled, who had stopped waking up in the middle of the night the way she had for the first few months after her father left, who had found, in this house with its wood smoke smell and its unevenly lit rooms, something that felt like belonging. She thought about what was beneath the floor of the small room. She thought about 48 sealed containers in a concrete chamber that had been built, as best she could tell, sometime in the 1930s by a man named Elias Hargreave, who had run agricultural import concerns across the region and whose business had been the subject of careful newspaper language in 1942. She thought about Raymond Callahan, who had owned this house for over 60 years and said nothing to anyone about what lay beneath it, and who had, at the end of his life, given it to her. She was not a person who believed in providence or fate or the curated interventions of the universe. She believed in decisions and their consequences, in the accumulated weight of choices made over time, in the way that one thing led to another through causes that were usually traceable if you looked carefully enough. She believed that Raymond Callahan had made a deliberate decision and that the decision had consequences she was only beginning to understand. The painted horse was on the windowsill in Lily's room. She had brought it with them from the apartment. It was the one object she had been most careful with during the move, wrapping it herself in 2 layers of paper and carrying it in her lap for the drive. It was small and slightly faded, a red-brown color with a white stripe down the face, and it had sat on some windowsill of hers for nearly 30 years. She went and looked at it for a moment in the last of the afternoon light. Then she went to make dinner, because Lily needed to eat, and the arithmetic of ordinary life did not pause for extraordinary circumstances. It simply continued alongside them, as it always had, as it always would, and the measure of a person was often found in the steadiness with which they kept moving through both at once. The lawyer Rachel recommended was a man named Daniel Voss, who practiced out of an office 2 towns over from Harlow County and who specialized in exactly the intersection of property law and historic asset recovery that Rachel had described. He was brisk and precise on the phone, asked several very specific questions, and told Nora to bring everything she had, the documents from the estate, the county records she had pulled, her notes, to a meeting the following week. In the meantime, he said, document everything you can without touching anything. Photographs, measurements, descriptions. Do not invite anyone else to view the space until we have spoken. And do not discuss the discovery with anyone outside your immediate family. Nora said she understood. She spent the days before the meeting doing exactly what he had told her. She photographed the shaft, the ladder, the ceiling of the chamber, the walls, the containers in their rows, the locked door at the far end, and every detail she could reach without disturbing anything. She measured, as best she could, the dimensions of the chamber. She wrote detailed descriptions of everything she had observed: the construction materials, the apparent age of the various elements, the condition of the containers, the specific location of the padlock on the secondary door. She did all of this in the early morning hours before Lily woke, working by flashlight in the chamber with a methodical care she brought to everything, and then climbing back up the ladder and replacing the boards and going to make coffee and getting her daughter ready for school as if the morning were entirely ordinary, which it was in every way except the one that mattered most. She was sitting in the small room one of those mornings, not in the chamber, just in a room above it, on the floor with her back against the wall and her coffee beside her when Lily appeared in the doorway. It was earlier than Lily usually woke, and she was still in her pajamas, her hair disordered from sleep, her eyes at the half-open stage that children operated at in the first minutes of consciousness. She looked at Nora sitting on the floor of the small room. She looked at the floor. She looked back at Nora. "You opened it," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nora said. Lily came and sat beside her, leaning her small warm weight against Nora's arm, and looked at the boards in the center of the floor where the seams were subtly different from the boards around them. "What was under it?" she asked. "I'm still figuring that out," Nora said. Lily considered this. Is it good or bad? Nora thought about the 48 containers in the cool old air. She thought about Raymond Callahan's silence. She thought about the $5 bill and the painted horse and the particular quality of her daughter's voice when she said this house likes us back, which was not a factual statement, but might have been, in its way, a true one. I think it might be very good, she said, but I need to be careful first. Lily nodded, accepting this the way she accepted most things Nora told her completely, without drama, the way children accept truths delivered by people they trust without question. Okay, Mommy, she said, and they sat together in the small room with its dense old floor in the early morning of a day that looked, from the outside, entirely like any other day in a life being rebuilt from scratch, while beneath them, in the dark and the still air, 48 containers waited with the particular patience of things that have already waited a very long time and are confident, now, that their waiting is almost done. Daniel Voss had the kind of office that communicated, without stating it, that the person behind the desk had dealt with complicated things before and had not been undone by any of them. The bookshelves were organized, but not decorative. The desk was clear except for a legal pad and a pen and the folder of documents Nora had sent ahead of the appointment. There were no framed achievements on the wall, no diplomas arranged for the visitor's reassurance. Just the shelves, the desk, the window overlooking a parking lot, and the man himself, who was somewhere in his early 60s and had the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to listen more than they speak. He had read everything she sent him before she arrived. She could tell by the way he moved through the documents during the first few minutes of their meeting, not scanning, but navigating, finding specific pages with the confidence of someone who had already formed a map. He asked her to describe the chamber in her own words. She did so precisely in the same order she had, written it down: the shaft, the ladder, the concrete walls, the ceiling, the containers, the secondary door with the newer padlock. He did not interrupt. He did not ask clarifying questions until she had finished. When he did ask, they were specific and practical. Had she touched any of the containers? Had she attempted to open any of them? Had she shared the discovery with anyone beyond her sister and the contractor Walt? And had Walt signed any kind of confidentiality agreement? She had not touched or opened anything. She had not shared it beyond Rachel and Walt. Walt had not signed anything, which was a gap that Daniel Voss noted on his legal pad without comment, but with the small particular efficiency of a man filing something for later. Then he asked a question she had not expected. Did your great-uncle ever communicate with you directly, beyond the bequest itself? She thought about the $5 bill. She said no. Did the estate documents include any letter, any personal communication, any instruction beyond the standard transfer of property? She had read every document Gerald Marsh had sent her. There had been no letter, no note, nothing that could be read as a message from Raymond Callahan to the great-niece he had chosen. Just the transfer itself, clean and legally complete and silent. Daniel Voss wrote something on his legal pad that she couldn't read from across the desk. All right, he said. Let me explain where you stand. What followed was an hour that Nora would later describe to Rachel as the most useful and most unsettling hour of her adult life, which was a high bar. Daniel Voss was thorough and did not shade the difficult parts. The legal framework governing what Nora had found was not simple, he explained. It was not simple because the law around abandoned property, historic assets, and buried wealth varied significantly depending on the nature of the assets, the circumstances under which they were originally placed, and whether any existing parties could establish a prior claim. If the containers held ordinary abandoned property equipment, personal effects, goods with no special historical or legal status, Nora's claim as the property owner was strong and relatively uncomplicated. If they held assets that had been placed there during a period of legal uncertainty, wartime, financial crisis, governmental instability, the question of original ownership became more complex and potentially involved claims from institutions, estates, or governments that might assert prior rights. If they held currency, bonds, or financial instruments, the situation became more complex still because such instruments had their own legal histories and their own chains of ownership that might or might not be resolvable. And if the secondary door at the far end of the chamber opened onto something significant, which Daniel Voss said with the careful understatement of a man who suspected it did, then the entire framework might need to be renegotiated. What I want you to understand, he said, is that your strongest position right now is the one you're already in. You've documented everything. You haven't disturbed anything. You haven't made any public statements. You've retained legal counsel before taking any action. He looked at her steadily. Everything you've done in the last 2 weeks has been correct. Don't let urgency make you undo that now. She asked him what the next step was. He told her they would need a professional assessment of the chamber, a structural engineer to certify its safety, an archivist or historian to assess the visible materials and construction, and, depending on those findings, potentially a representative from the State Historic Preservation Office. All of this would need to happen before any container was opened, and all of it would need to be documented with the same care she had already applied. He also told her, in the same steady tone, that she should be prepared for the process to be slow, and that slow was not her enemy. Slow was what made the outcome sustainable. She drove home through the country roads of Harlow County with the afternoon light coming sideways through the bare trees and thought about what sustainable meant when you were a single mother with a bookkeeping practice and a house whose furnace was reluctant. Then she picked Lily up from school and made dinner and helped with homework and read 2 chapters of a book about a family of rabbits who lived in a meadow, and she did not think about the chamber at all until after Lily was asleep. Then she sat at the kitchen table and thought about it for a long time. The structural engineer came the following Thursday. His name was Dr. Patricia Osei, which surprised Nora only in the sense that she had unconsciously pictured someone older and male, which said something about her own accumulated assumptions that she made a quiet note to examine later. Dr. Osei was in her mid-40s and moved through the chamber with the systematic confidence of someone who had assessed unusual spaces before, taking measurements and notes and photographs with an efficiency that almost made the extraordinary feel ordinary. Her assessment took most of the day. When she emerged for the last time, and they sat together in the kitchen over the tea Nora had made, her conclusions were delivered in the same measured register she had maintained throughout. The chamber was structurally sound. It had been engineered with a quality of construction that was unusual for the period. She estimated the original build at between 1928 and 1935, based on the concrete composition and the formwork patterns visible in the walls. The concrete had cured correctly and had not experienced significant stress over the intervening decades. The shaft was load-bearing in a way that distributed the weight of the structure above it, which explained why the floor of the small room had never shown signs of settlement. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. The secondary door was set into a reinforced frame that was original to the chamber's construction, she said. Whatever was beyond it had been anticipated when the chamber was built, not added afterward. She recommended some ventilation improvements before any extended work was done in the space, and she suggested that the ladder rungs be tested individually before being relied upon for repeated access. Both of these were manageable. She submitted her report to Daniel Voss within the week. He reviewed it and approved the next step. The historian came from a state university. Her name was Professor Eleanor Marsh, no relation to Gerald. She confirmed immediately, in a slightly weary tone of someone who had explained this before, and she was a specialist in regional economic history with a secondary focus on the material culture of the Depression and pre-war periods. She had been recommended by Daniel Voss as someone who combined scholarly rigor with the ability to work within legal constraints, which was not, he had said, as common a combination as it should have been. Professor Marsh spent 2 days in the chamber. On the first day, she assessed the space itself, the construction, the layout, the arrangement of the containers, the secondary door, and took detailed notes without touching anything. On the second day, she examined the external surfaces of the containers, reading their markings, their construction, their apparent provenance, and building a preliminary framework for understanding what they represented. On the evening of the second day, she came and sat in Nora's kitchen, which had become the default meeting room for this expanding team of careful people, and she told Nora what she had seen. The containers, she said, were consistent with the private storage practices of certain categories of financial and commercial operators during the late 1920s and early 1930s, a period of significant economic instability during which a subset of individuals and institutions had moved substantial assets into non-institutional storage specifically to protect them from the volatility of the banking system. The markings on several of the containers corresponded to a system of private coding that her research had encountered before, associated with a network of agricultural and import enterprises that had operated across a wide regional area during this period. She said the name Elias Hargreave with the precision of someone who had been expecting to say it. Nora looked at her. "You know who he was?" Nora said. "I know who he was," Professor Marsh confirmed. He was one of several operators in this region during the late 1920s who built substantial wealth through a combination of legitimate commerce and practices that occupied a more complicated legal space. The early 1930s were a period during which several of those operators made decisions about the long-term security of their assets. She paused. "The agricultural newspaper mentioned in 1942 that you found that was the resolution of a federal inquiry that had begun in 1939. The inquiry was closed without prosecution, which was unusual. The records associated with it are classified under a historic document exemption that expired in 2019. Which means they're accessible now," Nora said. "Which means they're accessible now," Professor Marsh confirmed. Nora sat with that for a moment. "And the padlock on the secondary door," she said. "That's not from the 1930s. "No," Professor Marsh said. "The lock is consistent with hardware manufactured between 1968 and 1980. Someone was in that chamber during that period, and they locked that door." Raymond Callahan had purchased the house in 1951. He had lived alone in it for over 6 decades. He had gone into the chamber, had known about it, had descended the ladder, had stood among the containers, and had locked the secondary door. And then he had gone back upstairs and lived his quiet life and said nothing to anyone for the rest of it. "What's behind the door?" Nora asked. Professor Marsh looked at her for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "But given the construction of this chamber and the nature of what I've seen in the main space, I would not expect the answer to be simple." The process of obtaining authorization to open the containers was slower than Nora had hoped and faster than Daniel Voss had warned her it might be. There were filings with the State Historic Preservation Office, responses to those filings, a site visit from a representative whose name Nora couldn't quite catch, but whose expression, upon descending the ladder and standing in the chamber for the first time, she would remember for the rest of her life. There were legal determinations about the status of the assets, abandoned property under the relevant statutes, legally accrued to the property owner in the absence of any established competing claim from a living individual or extant institution, and there were insurance arrangements, and there were the slow procedural rhythms of official processes that Daniel Voss navigated with the practiced patience of someone who understood that patience was not passive but strategic. 6 weeks after Nora's first meeting with Daniel Voss, the authorization came through. The containers could be opened and assessed. A certified appraiser would be present. Professor Marsh would document. The process would be photographed throughout. And Nora, as the property owner, had the right to be present for every moment of it. She arranged for Lily to spend the day with Patrice and Chloe, who had by now become reliably present in their lives in the easy, undemanding way of genuine friendship. She told Patrice only that she had some work on the house to deal with, which was technically accurate. The morning was cool and bright, with the particular clarity that comes after a stretch of rain when the sky has been washed into a deep and uncomplicated blue. She stood in the kitchen before anyone else arrived and drank her coffee and looked at the doorway to the back hallway, and she thought about Raymond Callahan one more time. She thought about the decision he had made, not the decision to hide the secret, but the decision to leave it to her. About what he had seen in a small girl with a $5 bill and a clear idea of what she wanted, that had made him believe, decades later, that she was the right person to inherit not just a house, but everything beneath it. She hoped she was living up to what he'd thought of her. She thought she was. She was trying to. The team arrived in a sequence that was almost ceremonial in its order. Dr. Osei first, to confirm the ventilation and structural preparations she had specified. Then Professor Marsh, with a graduate student assistant and 2 crates of archival materials and equipment. Then the appraiser, a quiet man from a firm that specialized in historic assets, whose name was Marcus Webb and who wore, to the farmhouse in Harlow County, a suit that seemed to belong to a different kind of room. Then Daniel Voss, last, carrying nothing but his legal pad and his pen and the composed expression of a man who had prepared for this thoroughly and was now simply present for it. They descended together. The chamber received them the way it had received everyone, with its particular cool air and its ancient silence, and the rows of containers along the walls that were exactly where they had always been, exactly as patient as they had always been. Marcus Webb began at the left end of the first row, working with the methodical care of his profession. He examined the exterior of each container before touching the lock, noting the construction, the markings, the apparent condition. He photographed each one before and after opening. Professor Marsh stood at his shoulder, recording. The first container, opened with a sound that was less dramatic than the moment, deserved a low mechanical click as the lock disengaged, and then the slight resistance of a seal breaking, a thin sigh of air that had been held inside for decades. Marcus Webb lifted the lid carefully and set it aside. Inside, packed in oil-treated cloth and layered between sheets of wax paper that had yellowed but held, were documents. They were extraordinary documents, not in their appearance, which was that of aged paper with faded ink, but in their content, which Professor Marsh identified within minutes of her first careful examination. Account ledgers, transaction records, correspondence on the letterheads of financial institutions that had not, as institutions, existed for decades, though some of their successors operated today under different names. The handwriting was precise and consistent. The numbers were specific. The dates clustered around the late 1920s and early 1930s, the period of maximum instability and maximum movement of assets by those who had the means and the foresight to move them. Marcus Webb opened the second container. This one held more documents, but interspersed among them, wrapped individually in the same oil-treated cloth, were smaller objects. Pocket watches, fountain pens, a set of cufflinks, a small leather notebook that Professor Marsh handled with particular care, reading the first page with an expression that moved through recognition and settled somewhere more complicated. The third container was heavier than the first 2. Marcus Webb lifted the lid, and the room was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly longer than moments usually did. Inside, stacked in even rows and wrapped in cloth that had once been brown and had faded to a pale, dusty gold, were gold bars. Each one was approximately the size of a large book, marked along the upper surface with serial numbers and institutional stamps. Marcus Webb lifted one carefully, turned it, read the stamps with a practiced eye. He set it back down without comment. Then he lifted his camera and photographed the interior of the container comprehensively from 4 angles before stepping back. He turned to Nora. His expression was composed in the way of a man who was very good at his job. The stamps on these bars, he said, correspond to a private institutional series issued between 1927 and 1931 by a consortium of regional banks that participated in a coordinated private reserve program during the lead-up to the Depression. The bars are authenticated by the stamp series and the serial sequence. I'll need to run each serial number through the historic registry to confirm individual provenance, but the preliminary identification is consistent. Nora looked at the bars, at the pale gold cloth, at the serial numbers stamped in a metal that had been underground since before her parents were born. "What are they worth?" she asked. He named a figure per bar that she had to hear twice to be sure she had heard it correctly the first time. Then he told her there appeared to be approximately 40 bars in this container alone. He said this in the same measure register he had used for everything else, because Marcus Webb was a professional, and professionals did not change their tone when the numbers got very large. Nora nodded. She did not say anything. She was doing arithmetic in her head that had nothing to do with the kind of arithmetic she had been doing for the past 4 years. The fourth container held more documents. The fifth held silver coins, bundled and sealed, their dates spanning a narrow range of years in the early 1930s. The sixth held certificates. Professor Marsh identified them as bearer bonds financial instruments that, in the period of their issue, were transferable simply by possession, their value payable to whoever held them. Several were in denominations that had once represented significant sums. Others were in denominations that required more careful assessment. Their face value translated through the intervening decades by rates of interest and historical equivalency calculations that Marcus Webb made notes about without attempting them on the spot. The seventh container held what none of them had expected. It was documents again, but different from the first set. These were not ledgers or transaction records. They were personal papers letters, written in a hand that Professor Marsh identified, after reading for several minutes, as Elias Hargreave's own. She read quietly, not aloud. Her graduate student stood a respectful distance behind her, photographing as directed. When she finally looked up, she addressed Nora directly rather than the room. "These are letters to Hargreave from associates," she said, "and copies of his replies. They describe, in terms that are indirect but not quite indirect enough, the nature of the operation that placed these assets here. He was not simply storing his own wealth. He was holding assets for others, a consortium of individuals who had decided, collectively, that institutional banking in this region could no longer be trusted to survive what was coming." She paused. Several of the names in these letters are recognizable, not to the general public, but to historians of this period and this region. These were significant people. Were their estates ever resolved? Nora asked. "Some," Professor Marsh said. "Others disappeared from the historical record in ways that the letters here may help explain." She held the folder carefully, as if it contained something fragile, which it did not physically, but in every other sense. He was keeping these safe for them, and then something happened that prevented them from returning. What happened? Professor Marsh was quiet for a moment. "I don't know the full answer yet, but the letters stop in 1942, the same year as the federal inquiry." She looked at Nora, "And the padlock on that secondary door is from after that." They had been in the chamber for 4 hours. They had opened 7 containers. There were 41 remaining. Daniel Voss suggested they stop for the day, which was the suggestion of a prudent man who understood that documentation needed to be processed before it was compounded, and that the human capacity for absorbing extraordinary information had limits that it was unwise to test. Nora agreed. She was not tired exactly. She was something else, something that didn't have a precise word, a state of being simultaneously very alert and slightly outside herself, as if the part of her mind that processed the immediate world and the part that processed meaning were running at different speeds. She walked through the farmhouse after everyone had gone, through the front room and the kitchen and the back hallway, and she stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at the boards that covered the shaft, and she thought about what was still down there. 41 containers. A secondary door with a padlock from the late 1960s or early 1970s. And behind the door, whatever Raymond Callahan had known about and chosen to keep locked. She called Patrice and asked if Lily could stay a little longer. Patrice said of course. They were just finishing dinner, and Lily was deeply engaged in a dispute with Chloe about the correct rules of a card game they had invented together, and she seemed fine. Nora thanked her and hung up and sat on the floor of the small room, the same way she had sat there with Lily in the early morning weeks ago, and she let the silence of the house settle around her. The furnace was running. The kitchen faucet dripped once. Outside, a bird made a sound that was not quite a song, but was something. She thought about Rachel saying, "I'm sorry I told you to sell it." She thought about Dana saying, "You've already decided." She thought about her landlord's slow, reluctant responses and the flickering break-room light and the 4 years of arithmetic and the way Lily had stopped waking up in the middle of the night. She thought about what the next weeks would bring the remaining containers, the secondary door, the historic registry, the legal determinations, the slow unfolding of numbers that Marcus Webb would compile into reports that she would read at this kitchen table, and that would describe, in the formal language of assessment and valuation, what Elias Hargreave had built beneath a farmhouse in Harlow County and what Raymond Callahan had preserved and what she had, in the end, simply found. She did not allow herself to arrive at the final number yet. That was not practical. That was the kind of thinking that led to decisions made from the wrong place. She had learned that lesson over 4 years of keeping herself grounded in what was real and present, and she did not intend to unlearn it now. But she allowed herself, sitting alone on the floor of the small room, to feel the shape of the possibility. Not its specifics, not its details, but its general weight and dimension. The sense that the arithmetic she had been doing for 4 years, the tight, careful arithmetic of not quite enough, was about to change in a fundamental way. That the numbers, going forward, would not require the same constant vigilance. That the particular exhaustion of managing a life on a margin so thin it allowed for no mistakes might be lifting. That Lily might grow up in a house that was entirely hers. That was the thing she let herself feel. Not wealth, not vindication, not the satisfaction of having been proven right when others doubted. Just that, a house, entirely hers, and the particular quiet that came with it. The same quiet that had been in this farmhouse when she first walked through it, gray and cold and imperfect, with a leaning porch and a cracked window and a floor that a 6-year-old girl had listened to with the patient certainty of someone who already knew what the adults were still working out. She got up, eventually, and went to get her daughter. The second session in the chamber was 2 days later, and it was the session that changed everything, not because of what the containers held, though what they held was extraordinary, but because of what happened in the last hour of the day. They had worked through 12 more containers. The pattern continued and deepened. More documents, more financial instruments, more gold, a different series of bars in the 11th container, marked with stamps that Professor Marsh identified as belonging to a separate institution from the first series, suggesting that the original consortium had been larger than the letters alone indicated. The 12th container held something unexpected, a collection of art objects, small and portable, each wrapped individually in oilcloth. Miniature paintings on wood panel, carved ivory pieces, a small bronze figure whose style Professor Marsh identified as pre-Columbian, American export of which had been restricted since the mid-20th century and whose presence here raised questions she recorded carefully and deferred for later. Marcus Webb's notes had become a document of considerable length. His preliminary valuations were estimates only. He emphasized that every stage proper appraisal would require laboratory analysis, provenance research, market comparisons, but the estimates were not small. The gold alone, at current market, was in a range that Nora found difficult to hold in her mind as a real number. The financial instruments required more complex calculation, their face values adjusted through interest accrual and historic equivalency, but they added substantially to the total. The art objects introduced variables that couldn't be resolved without specialist input. The number, in aggregate, was not yet precise, but its general order of magnitude was becoming visible, the way an outline becomes visible before the details fill in, and the outline was staggering. They were opening the 23rd container, more documents, densely packed, Professor Marsh working through them with quiet focus when her graduate student, who had been photographing the secondary door at the far end of the chamber for the 3rd time that day, said something quietly, and Professor Marsh looked up. Then Professor Marsh said, "Nora." The padlock on the secondary door was open. Not broken, not forced. Open, the shackle released, hanging from the hasp the way a lock hung when someone had used the correct key. The door itself was still closed, but the lock was open. Nora looked at it. She looked at Daniel Voss, who was looking at the lock with the expression of a man recalculating. She looked at Professor Marsh. "Did anyone?" she began. "No," Daniel Voss said before she finished. "No one has been near that door today." They stood in the chamber and looked at the open lock, and the question that no one asked aloud was the one that filled the space between them. If no one had opened it today, and it had been locked the last time anyone was here, then when had it been opened, and by whom? Daniel Voss was the first to speak, and what he said was measured and careful in the way of a man who was managing a situation whose edges he could not yet fully see. "We need to stop for today," he said, "and we need to address this carefully." Professor Marsh was looking at the door. Her expression was not alarmed. It was the focused expression of a historian who had encountered something that changed her working theory and was now revising. "Raymond," she said, almost to herself, Nora looked at her. "There's another key," Professor Marsh said. "He would have had one. And if he gave the house to you without instructions," she paused, "he may have arranged for someone else to do what he couldn't do himself." The chamber was very quiet. The old air moved slightly, as if the opening of the padlock had disturbed something that had been still for a long time. Nora looked at the door, at the open lock hanging from the hasp, at the narrow seam of darkness along the door's edge that suggested it was not fully latched, that if she reached out and pushed it open, it would give. She did not push it open. She was a careful person. She had been careful from the beginning, and she was not going to stop now, not when it mattered most. But she looked at that door for a long moment, and she thought about Raymond Callahan and his long solitary life and his silence and his $5 bill and his particular confidence in her, and she thought that whatever was behind it had been waiting even longer than the rest of what was down here, that it had been locked away separately by deliberate choice, by a man who understood what he was locking away, that would wait one more day. She was the last one up the ladder that evening. She stood at the top and looked down into the chamber one last time. The containers, the walls, the arching ceiling, and at the far end, barely visible in the remaining light, the secondary door with its open lock. Then she climbed out and replaced the boards and went to make dinner, because Lily would be home soon and hunger did not wait for historic discoveries. But her hands were not quite steady as she moved through the kitchen. And when Lily came in the door and dropped her backpack and said, "Mommy, what did you find today?" with the uncanny accuracy of a child who reads her mother more precisely than her mother reads most documents, Nora looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Something important," she said. Lily studied her with those serious eyes. "Behind the door?" she asked. Nora had never mentioned a door to her. "Yes," Nora said. "Behind the door." Lily nodded, accepting this with the same complete seriousness she had shown from the beginning, as if she had already known. In the particular way, she seemed to know things not through information, but through attention, through the quality of listening she had brought to the floor of the small room on the first day and had never quite put down. "That's the part that was waiting the longest," Lily said. Nora looked at her. "How do you know that?" Lily considered. "Because when you find a secret," she said, with the confidence of someone reporting a fact rather than offering an opinion, "the biggest part is always behind the last door." Nora sat down on the kitchen floor, which was not where she had intended to sit, and put her arms around her daughter, and held her there while the kitchen light came on in the dusk, and the farmhouse settled around them with the particular sound of old wood accommodating the end of an extraordinary day. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and the feeling that was moving through her was not sadness or relief or grief, but something that combined elements of all of those without being exactly any of them. It was the feeling of standing at the precise point where something long endured becomes something finally seen. Tomorrow, she would open the door. Tonight, she held her daughter in the kitchen of a house that was entirely theirs, on a piece of land that had given up a secret it had been keeping for nearly a century, and she let herself be present in the moment before the final revelation, not rushing toward it, not pulling back from it, but simply there in the warmth and the quiet and the certainty that whatever came next, she had earned the right to face it. Asterisk to be continued in Part 3. Asterisk the days between the first discovery and Daniel Voss's appointment had their own particular texture. Nora moved through them steadily: the bookkeeping, the school runs, the meals, the slow repair of the back fence, and underneath all of it ran the constant, quiet awareness of the chamber. She had not returned to it since the morning she had climbed back up the ladder with Walt. She had made that decision deliberately, in the same way she made most decisions. Not out of fear, but out of the recognition that patience was not the absence of action, but a form of it. She told Lily only that there was something important beneath the small room, and that they needed to be patient while Nora figured out the right way to handle it. Lily had absorbed this with her characteristic seriousness. On the third evening, she had appeared in the kitchen doorway while Nora was washing dishes and said, without preamble, "The thing under the floor is patient. It's been waiting a long time, so it doesn't mind a little more." Then she had returned to her room without asking anything further, and Nora had stood with her hands in warm water and thought that her daughter was, quite possibly, the most extraordinary person she had ever known. Rachel called every day, not always for long, sometimes just 5 minutes, a checking in that was structured around the specific question of whether anything had changed and the general question of how Nora was managing. Rachel's alarm had settled into a steadier register now, the kind that was still present but had found a rhythm. She had located Daniel Voss through a former colleague who described him as the person you wanted when history and money occupied the same legal space, which was as accurate a description as Nora had found. Walt had come by once without being asked. He had stood in the kitchen and drank coffee and said very little, and then before he left he had said, "Whatever happens, the house is sound." She had appreciated that more than a longer speech would have warranted. The neighbors did not yet know. Harlow County moved the way small communities moved. Information traveled at variable speeds and often arrived before its official source. Nora was careful. She answered questions about the repairs and said nothing about what lay beneath the floor. This was not deception. It was the management of a situation that was not yet stable enough to share. She had learned, in the 4 years since her marriage ended, that sharing something before it was solid often made it harder to hold. After the meeting with Daniel Voss, she had driven home through the county roads with the afternoon light coming sideways through the bare trees, turning everything pale and deliberate. She had processed the legal framework. He had described the framework of abandoned property and historic assets, and the particular complexities introduced by financial instruments whose chain of ownership had been interrupted by decades and the dissolution of institutions, and what she had emerged with, by the time she pulled into the gravel driveway, was a map. Not comfortable, not simple, but navigable. She had always been better with a map than without one. The team that assembled over the following weeks became, without planning, to a kind of temporary community. Professor Marsh and her, graduate student, Marcus Webb, Dr. Osei, Daniel Voss. They moved through the kitchen and the hallway with the increasing ease of people who had shared a significant experience. The kitchen table became the place where things were discussed and processed and decided, with tea that Nora made and sometimes coffee from the thermos that Walt had once brought and which Marcus Webb appeared to have adopted as a personal tradition. Once, memorably, Patrice had sent a pie home with Lily, and it had been distributed among 6 people as an impromptu afternoon break from the weight of what they were uncovering. And the conversation at the table that afternoon had been, for 20 minutes, entirely about pie, and Nora had been grateful for it. Professor Marsh explained, during one of those sessions, what the broader historical context meant. The network of individuals who had originally placed assets in the chamber had been, in their time, among the most consequential economic operators in the region. Several had vanished from the historical record in ways that had never been fully resolved, deaths documented, but vaguely, business closures that left no traceable remainder, families that moved away without forwarding addresses. The federal inquiry of 1939 to 1942 had touched several of them without producing formal resolution, which suggested either that the evidence was insufficient at the time or that the resolution had occurred through channels that did not generate paper. Raymond knew all of this, Nora said. He must have, Professor Marsh said. The padlock is evidence that he knew what was behind that secondary door and made a deliberate decision about it. He kept everything else intact for 60 years. Not out of inertia, Professor Marsh said. Out of decision. The picture of Raymond Callahan that had been forming the quiet man who smelled of wood smoke and said little and pressed a $5 bill into a small girl's hand was becoming something fuller and more complicated. Not a man who had stumbled onto something and frozen. A man who had understood what he possessed and understood what it required. Who had exercised for 6 decades a patience that was not passive but sustained. Who had, in the end, identified the one person he trusted with the whole of it. Nora was not certain she was worthy of that trust. She was doing her best to be. On the morning of the first container session, she had woken before dawn and lain in the dark listening to the house. The furnace, the dripping faucet, the birds beginning outside, the language of old wood contracting in the cooling of the pre-dawn hour. The house had its own patience, she thought. It had held its secret and held its occupants and held the weight of the earth above the chamber for nearly a century. That steadiness was not accidental. It had been built into the thing. She thought about what it would mean for Lily. Not the money was still partly abstract, a set of numbers that Marcus Webb delivered in the same measure register he used for everything, so that their magnitude took time to land. She thought about what it would mean for Lily to grow up without the particular background anxiety that Nora had carried for 4 years, the constant management of a margin so thin it allowed no mistakes, the vigilance that consumed a portion of every day's energy without showing on the surface. That anxiety was invisible from the outside. From the inside, it was weather. It was always there. Lily would not have that. Whatever else the next weeks brought, Lily would not have that. That was the thought she had carried through the first session, through the gold bars and the institutional stamps, and Professor Marsh's careful voice reading the names in the 7th container's letters with the precision of a historian who recognized what she was looking at and understood its weight. She had held it the way you held the one true thing when everything else was moving. That evening, after the team had gone and the boards were replaced and the back door was locked, she had called Rachel. She had told her the preliminary numbers, the approximate ones, the ones with all Marcus Webb's professional caveats attached. Rachel had been quiet for a while. He knew. Rachel said finally. Raymond knew the whole time. The whole time, Nora confirmed. Another silence. Then Rachel said, in a voice that was quieter than her usual register, "I'm sorry I told you to sell it." "You said that already," Nora told her. "I know," Rachel said. "I think I'll be saying it for a while." The morning she opened the door, Nora woke before the alarm and lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn light, listening to the house. The furnace, the faucet, the birds beginning their first tentative sounds outside the window. She had slept better than she expected, not deeply, not without interruption, but with the particular quality of sleep that comes when a decision has already been made and there is nothing left to deliberate. The deliberating was done. What remained was simply the doing of it. She got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window in the dark, watching the fields lighten by degrees, the way they did at this hour, not all at once, but gradually, as if the day were assembling itself piece by piece, checking each element before committing to it. She had come to know this view in the months since the move. The shape of the tree-line at the north end of the property. The way the old fence posts caught the first light at a particular angle in early spring. The dry stream bed along the eastern boundary that filled slightly when it rained and emptied again in a day or two, patient in its impermanence. She thought about Raymond Callahan standing in this kitchen, or in whatever version of this kitchen had existed in his time, looking at this same view, knowing what was beneath the small room at the back of the house, carrying that knowledge for 60 years without putting it down. She understood him better now than she had when she first read Gerald Marsh's letter. She understood the weight of it and the discipline of it and the particular kind of love it expressed, not demonstrative, not articulate, but present. The kind of love that showed itself in choices made carefully and quietly over a very long time. She drank her coffee. She woke Lily and made breakfast and put her on the school bus and watched it disappear down the county road. Then she came back inside and called Daniel Voss to confirm the day's schedule. And then she went into the small room and waited for the team to arrive. They came in the same order as before. Dr. Osei first, then Professor Marsh and her graduate student, then Marcus Webb, then Daniel Voss. They descended the ladder in the same sequence. The chamber received them, as it always had, cool, still, the old air parting slightly around the warmth of living bodies. The secondary door was as they had left it, the padlock still open, still hanging from the hasp. The door itself still closed, its seam of darkness unchanged, as if the night had not touched it. Professor Marsh examined the door, first not to open it, but to document. She photographed the padlock, the frame, the hinges, the surface of the door itself, which was steel. She confirmed on closer inspection, painted over several times in a sequence of colors that spoke of different eras of upkeep. She noted the lock's manufacturer's stamp, which matched her earlier estimate of late 1960s to early 1970s manufacture, and she noted the condition of the hasp worn smooth at the contact point in a way that suggested regular use over a period of years. Someone had opened and closed this door many times. And then it stopped. Daniel Voss confirmed, for the record and for the documentation, that no legal impediment remained to opening the door, that the authorization they had obtained covered the full extent of the chamber and any attached spaces, and that what they were about to do was sanctioned, documented, and witnessed. Then he looked at Nora. "It's your house," he said. She stepped forward and pressed her palm against the door. The steel was cold and smooth beneath her hand. She pushed. The door opened inward on hinges that were better maintained than their age should have allowed. They had been oiled recently enough that the movement was quiet rather than dramatic. The darkness beyond gave way to the beam of her flashlight, and then, as she stepped through the threshold and the others followed with their own lights, to something she had not expected. The space beyond was small. Not another chamber, not another vault, not another set of rows of containers waiting in ancient patience. It was a room perhaps 12 feet by 10, its walls concrete like the main chamber, its floor the same smooth, dry surface. But it was furnished, not elaborately, not comfortably in any modern sense, but furnished with purpose and with care. A desk occupied one wall. Old wood, solid, scarred with use. Above it, mounted to the concrete, a series of hooks held folders, their labels handwritten and faded but legible. A narrow cot frame stood against the opposite wall, its surface bare now, but showing the compressed marks of a mattress used for years. A single shelf held objects arranged with deliberate order: a kerosene lamp, its glass chimney clean, a set of tools for writing, a water filter, old but identifiable, a small tin box sealed, and on the desk, positioned in the center as if it had been placed there to be found, was an envelope. The envelope was not old. It was not yellowed or fragile. It was the kind of envelope sold in any drugstore, white, sealed, with a single word written on the front in a hand that Nora had never seen before but recognized immediately as belonging to a person who had written carefully, who had thought about each letter before committing it to paper. The word on the envelope was Nora. She stood in front of it for a long moment. She was aware of the team behind her, of their stillness, of the particular quality of silence that descended when a room full of careful people collectively decided not to speak. She was aware of the desk under the envelope and the shelf above it and the cot frame and the hooks on the wall. She was aware of the small tin box on the shelf and the kerosene lamp with its clean chimney, cleaned by someone who had stood here not very long ago. She picked up the envelope. The paper was crisp, recent. She turned it over and opened it, breaking a seal that had been pressed down firmly. And she took out the single sheet inside and unfolded it and read it in the beam of her flashlight, standing in a room that Raymond Callahan had built and furnished and locked, and, in the end, unlocked or had arranged to have unlocked for the specific purpose of this moment. The letter was short. It was written in the same deliberate hand as the name on the envelope, and it said, "You found it. I knew you would. Not because you were looking for it, because you weren't, and that was the point. I needed someone who would come here for the right reasons, fix what needed fixing, and listen to the house. You always listened, even when you were small. I watched you listen. What's in the main room I held in trust for people who couldn't come back for it. The documents in the desk will tell you who they were and what I know of what happened to them. Some of their descendants can be found. The assets should go to them, as much as the law will allow. Daniel Voss will know how to navigate that he did work for me once a long time ago, and I trust his judgment. What's in the tin box is mine, and now it's yours. It was never part of the trust. It was separate from the beginning. Take care of your daughter. Take care of the house. It's a good house. It knows how to hold things." Raymond, she read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope and set it on the desk and looked at the tin box on the shelf. Marcus Webb was already photographing the room from the doorway. Professor Marsh had moved to the desk and was beginning, carefully, to examine the folders on the hooks. Daniel Voss stood near the entrance with his legal pad and his pen and his expression of composed attention. None of them said anything. She appreciated that more than she could have expressed. She took the tin box from the shelf. It was heavier than its size suggested, not dramatically, but noticeably, the weight of something dense inside something small. The lid was fitted rather than hinged, pressed down with a precision that required effort to break. She worked it loose carefully, the way she worked everything loose steadily, without forcing. Inside, nested in a cloth that had once been red and had faded to a dusky rose, were coins. Not the bundled, sealed coins of the main chamber, the investment coins, the institutional coins, the coins that were assets in the financial sense. These were different. These were specific, a dozen, perhaps 14, arranged loosely in the cloth, their surfaces worn smooth by handling, by decades of being turned over in someone's hand. She picked one up and looked at it in the flashlight beam. It was gold, old gold, dark and warm, its face bearing the impression of a date and a design that she didn't immediately recognize, but that Professor Marsh, who had appeared quietly at her shoulder, identified within seconds. Double eagles, Professor Marsh said. Her voice was soft. American pre-1933. These were privately held gold coins that were called in by the government during the Depression. Most people turned them over. Some people didn't. She was quiet for a moment. These are each worth considerably more than their gold content. Numismatic value, condition, rarity, history. She paused again. Raymond kept these separate from the trust assets. They were never part of what Hargreave deposited. They were his, Nora said. They were his, Professor Marsh confirmed. And now they're yours. Marcus Webb asked, gently, whether he could examine them. She handed him the box. He worked through them one by one, holding each to the light, checking dates and mint marks, making notes in the quiet, thorough manner that was entirely his own. When he had finished, he looked at her. The coin value alone, he said, is in the range of $800,000. Certified, it could be higher. Some of these dates are significant. She nodded. She put the box back on the shelf for now, carefully, next to the kerosene lamp with its clean chimney. Then she turned and looked at the room. The desk with its folders. The shelf with its ordered objects. The cot frame against the wall. The tin box now sitting in the lamplight that wasn't there, the imagined lamplight of a man who had sat in this room many times, who had come down through the shaft and through the secondary door and sat at the desk and read his folders and thought his long, patient thoughts, and then climbed back up and gone about his ordinary days, season after season, decade after decade. She felt the fullness of him in the room. Not as a presence, she was not a person given to the supernatural, but as the accumulated weight of decision. Every time he had come down here, he had made the decision again. Every time he had climbed back up and said nothing to anyone, he had renewed it. 60 years of renewable silence, broken only at the end, and only to her, and only in the most careful way possible. She stayed in the room longer than was strictly necessary. The team worked around her, documenting and photographing, and she stood at the center of it and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened, not the assets, not the numbers, not the legal and historical complexity that the next months would require her to navigate, but the human thing underneath all of it. The trust, the long, quiet bet that Raymond Callahan had placed on a girl he barely knew, because he had watched her listen. She thought about the painted horse on the windowsill in Lily's room. She thought about what listening had cost him, and what it had given him, and what he had decided to do with both. Then she went back through the door and up the ladder into the small room and out into the kitchen of her house, where the light was ordinary and the faucet was dripping again, and the afternoon was beginning its familiar descent toward the hour when the school bus came. The weeks that followed were the weeks of resolution, slow, complex, demanding in ways that the discovery itself had not been, because the discovery had required only attention and patience, and resolution required those things, and also lawyers and historians and appraisers and government representatives, and a great deal of paperwork in the specific, exhausting language of official processes. Daniel Voss, it turned out, had indeed done work for Raymond Callahan. He confirmed this with the careful brevity of a man who had expected to be asked eventually. He had handled some estate planning matters in Raymond's final years, and Raymond had, at that time, described the nature of the property in terms that were oblique enough to provide legal cover, but specific enough to prepare Voss for what Nora might one day bring him. He had not disclosed the chamber's full contents that would have created legal obligations that Raymond had wanted Nora to control the timing of. But he had prepared, quietly, in the way that Raymond had prepared for everything. Nora sat across from him in his office when he told her this and thought about the specific quality of that kind of trust, the kind that prepared without controlling, that arranged without dictating, that gave a person what they needed and then stepped back and let them use it. "He thought a great deal of you," Daniel Voss said. "He barely knew me," Nora said. "Some people," Daniel Voss replied, "are very efficient at knowing what they need to know." The documents in the desk behind the secondary door became, under Professor Marsh's careful analysis, something close to a historical revelation. Raymond had spent decades quietly researching the fates of the consortium members who had originally deposited assets in the chamber, tracking what had happened to them through newspaper archives, public records, family histories, the long paper trail of ordinary life. Several had died during the 1940s under circumstances that remained murky, but that the documents Nora had found in the main chamber shed uncomfortable light upon. Others had simply vanished. A few had surviving descendants whose family histories contained gaps and silences that Raymond's research, and now Professor Marsh's, began to fill. The process of identifying those descendants and establishing their connection to the original assets was slow, but it was not impossible. Daniel Voss coordinated with a specialist in estate recovery. Professor Marsh consulted with colleagues across 3 universities. The legal framework was complicated: assets held in trust by a deceased person, originating from parties whose own estates had never been formally resolved, but it was not unprecedented, and Daniel Voss navigated it with the same patient expertise he brought to everything. Not all of the assets would go to descendants. The legal reality was more complex than the moral one. Some would be subject to government claim. Some would be allocated through historic preservation channels. Some would remain legally Nora's, as the property owner and the inheritor of Raymond's role as trustee. The final allocation was a document that took 4 months to produce and that Nora read 3 times before signing it, because she was a person who read things 3 times before she signed them, and no amount of life-changing wealth was going to change that. But when the allocation was finalized, when the numbers were certified and the appraisals were complete and the legal processes had run their course, the total was known. The gold, valued at current market with the institutional provenance established by Professor Marsh's research. The bearer bonds, calculated with accumulated interest and historical equivalency. The financial instruments, assessed through the specialist firm that Marcus Webb engaged. The art objects, appraised by a specialist who had come down from a museum in the city and spent 2 days in the chamber and emerged looking slightly different from how she had entered. The documents themselves, which carried historical value beyond the assets they described. The coins, Raymond's coins, certified and valued. The total, Nora's share after the legal allocations, after the descendant claims, after the government processes had taken what they were entitled to, was $290 million. She had known the number was coming for several weeks before it arrived in its final, official form. She had watched it assemble itself from the preliminary estimates and the appraisals and the legal determinations, the way you watch a structure take shape from its framework, and she had tried to prepare for it the way you prepared for things you could not fully imagine until they were real. She was in the kitchen when Daniel Voss called with the certified figure. Lily was at school. The faucet was dripping. The light through the window over the sink was the clear, clean light of a late spring morning. She sat down at the kitchen table with the phone, and she listened to Daniel Voss read the number. And then she said, "Thank you," and set the phone down and looked at the kitchen. The wall she had painted herself in the second month, a warm white that had taken 3 coats because the old surface was reluctant. The curtains she had sewn from fabric she'd bought at the general store in town, because sewing was something she knew how to do, and it was cheaper than buying curtains, and she had wanted this kitchen to look like itself rather than like anyone else's. The table that had come from the apartment, one of the few pieces of furniture that had survived the move, its surface marked with the evidence of 4 years of meals eaten and homework done and long evenings worked through while Lily slept. This was her kitchen. This was her house. And beneath the floor of the small room down the hall, a man named Raymond Callahan had kept a secret for 60 years and had given it to her not as a gift exactly, but as a responsibility, because he had understood something about her that she was still in the process of understanding about herself. She called Rachel. Rachel picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting. Nora told her the number. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Nora checked the screen again. "Rachel, I'm here," Rachel said. Her voice was different, not the alarm register, not the careful practical register, but something she didn't use often. Something unguarded. "Nora." "I know," Nora said. "That's Rachel stopped. Start again. You're going to be okay." It was a simple thing to say. It was not adequate to the moment. It was also, Nora thought, exactly right, because okay was not a small word when you had spent 4 years not quite being it. Okay was enormous. Okay was the whole thing. "We're going to be okay," Nora said. She sat with Rachel on the phone for another 20 minutes, not talking about the number, but talking about ordinary things. Rachel's kids, the road trip they had been saying for 3 years they would take together, a book they had both started and neither had finished. The conversation of sisters who had been through enough together that they knew the difference between the moment and the meaning of the moment, and that sometimes the meaning was better approached sideways. When they hung up, Nora went to the small room and sat on the floor. She had not replaced the boards over the shaft since the final session. The opening sat in the center of the floor, covered only by the same planks she had placed there the first time, loosely, without the precision of concealment. She looked at it for a while. Then she heard the school bus. She heard Lily's boots on the porch steps, the deliberate, two-footed jump from the top step that she always did, the small thud that Nora could identify from anywhere in the house. She heard the front door open and the backpack land and the particular sound of Lily moving through the house, tracking her mother the way she had always done, by instinct rather than by calling out. Lily appeared in the doorway of the small room. She looked at Nora sitting on the floor. She looked at the covered shaft. She came and sat beside her, the way she had done before, pressing her small warm weight against her mother's arm. "Did you open the last door?" she asked. "Yes," Nora said. "What was behind it?" Nora thought about the desk and the folders and the cot frame and the tin box and the letter written in Raymond's careful hand. She thought about double eagle coins in faded red cloth. She thought about the number Daniel Voss had read to her from a certified document in his precise, unhurried voice. "Everything," she said. Lily considered this with her customary seriousness. "Good everything or bad everything?" "Good everything," Nora said. "The kind that changes things." Lily was quiet for a moment, leaning against her mother's arm, looking at the covered opening in the floor of the small room that she had identified on the very first visit as holding a secret, not because anyone had told her, but because she had listened. "Mommy," she said. "Yes." "Can we get dog now?" Nora laughed. It was not a small laugh or a controlled one. It was the full, surprised, unguarded kind that came when you had been holding something very tightly for a very long time, and something small and true and completely unexpected came along and unlocked it. She laughed until the small room echoed with it, and Lily laughed because her mother was laughing, and the farmhouse held them both in it the way it had always held things, steadily, without drama, with the particular patience of something that was built to last. Later that evening, after dinner, and after Lily was in bed with her book about the meadow rabbits, Nora went out onto the porch. It was level now. The posts were straight. The boards were solid underfoot, the way they should have been all along. She stood in the cool spring air and looked out over the 4 acres of Harlow County, the dark fields and the treeline at the north end and the dry stream bed along the eastern boundary, and she thought about Dana saying, "You've already decided," and Rachel saying, "I'm sorry I told you to sell it," and Walt saying the house is sound, and Daniel Voss saying it's your house. She thought about what it meant to decide something before you fully understood what you were deciding. To move toward a thing because it pulled at you, not because you could see the whole of it. She had not come to Harlow County for a vault. She had come because the house was hers, and Lily needed a backyard, and the arithmetic of the apartment was no longer something she could make work. She had come for the ordinary reasons that people made ordinary changes to their lives, and the extraordinary thing had been there waiting, as it had been waiting for 60 years, for someone to arrive for the right reasons. She went inside and checked on Lily, who was asleep with the book still open on the pillow beside her. She closed the book and turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her daughter in the dark. The painted horse was on the windowsill, exactly where it had always been. A small red-brown figure with a white stripe down the face, faded by 30 years of various windowsills, bought for $5 at a roadside stand by a girl who had known exactly what she wanted. She left the door, open the way Lily liked it, and went to bed. The months that followed changed things gradually and then all at once, in the way that real change usually worked, not a single dramatic reversal, but an accumulation of smaller shifts that eventually reached a tipping point, after which the old state was simply no longer the current one. The legal processes concluded. The descendant allocations were made. 3 families received significant portions of the assets, with documentation of the historical connection that Professor Marsh had established. And those conversations, which Nora was not present for, but was briefed on afterward, were described as complicated and emotional, and ultimately, in each case, something close to healing. People learning that what had disappeared from their family histories had not simply vanished, but had been held carefully against the day it could be returned. The State Historic Preservation Office designated a portion of the documents as materials of significant public historical interest. A university archive acquired digital copies. Professor Marsh published a paper that was careful and thorough and that earned, in the academic circles it was aimed at, the particular respect that comes from work that is both scholarly and courageous. Nora paid off the debts that had accumulated since her marriage ended not many, but real, the small financial injuries of a tight life. She repaired the farmhouse fully, not to the point of renovation, but to the point of genuine soundness. The furnace replaced, and the roof sealed, and the electrical completed, and the faucet fixed. Finally, permanently, because she was done with the sound of dripping. She hired a local man to build a fence around the yard at the back of the house, because Lily had not stopped asking about the dog, and a dog would need a yard. She did not move away from Harlow County. She had considered it briefly, in the way you considered things that were possible, but not necessarily right. She had walked the 4 acres and stood in the kitchen and looked at the dry stream bed and thought about it. And then she had decided in the simple, quiet way she decided things that she was home. That home was not a quality you searched for, but a quality you recognized when you were paying attention in the place where you already were. Lily started 2nd grade at the county school with a comfortable rug and a music teacher who also taught art. She brought home drawings with more detail in them, now houses with windows that had curtains, fields with fence lines, a dog that existed only in anticipation but was rendered with complete conviction. She talked about Chloe and about a boy in her class named Marcus who was very serious and very funny, which Lily said without apparent awareness of the tension between those 2 qualities. She did not ask about the chamber anymore. She seemed to understand, in the way she understood most things, that it had given what it had to give and was now simply part of the house, not a secret anymore, not a mystery, just a room beneath a room, which was what it had always been. Nora called Rachel every week. They were planning the road trip for the following summer, a real plan now, with dates and reservations, and a route that went through places neither of them had been. Rachel had stopped saying, "I'm sorry I told you to sell it." Not because she had forgotten it, but because it had completed itself, as apologies do when they've been genuinely received. On a morning in late autumn, when the light was low and gold over the fields, and the first frost had appeared on the fence posts overnight, Nora drove to the county library and returned the last of the research materials she had borrowed in those early weeks of the discovery. The librarian, the older woman who had pointed her to the microfilm machines without curiosity, was at the desk, and she smiled the smile of a person who noticed that someone who had come in searching had since found what they were looking for. "Did you get everything you needed?" she asked. Nora thought about the chamber and the containers and the letter in Raymond's hand and the double eagle coins in their faded red cloth and the number on the certified document and Lily's 2-footed jump from the porch step and the dog they had gotten the previous month, a 3-year-old hound mix named after no one in particular who slept at the foot of Lily's bed and was already, in the assessment of everyone who met him, completely at home. "Yes," she said, "I think I did." She drove back through Harlow County in the autumn light, through the county roads as she knew now by their particular turns and slopes and the way they felt different in different seasons. She pulled into the gravel driveway and sat for a moment looking at the house. The porch was level. The roof was sealed. The boards on the exterior had been painted in the summer a pale gray that she had chosen because it suited the light, and they held the paint the way old would held everything, stubbornly, with the resistance of something that intended to last. It was a good house. Raymond had been right about that. It knew how to hold things: history, secrets, grief, change, the weight of what lay beneath it, and the ordinary life lived above. It had held all of it without complaint, without drama, in the patient way of things that were built with intention and maintained with care. She got out of the car and walked up the porch steps level, solid, not going anywhere, and she opened the front door and went inside, into the light and the warmth and the sound of the dog's nails on the kitchen floor as he came to greet her, and the house received her the way it always had, the way it would continue to, which was without ceremony and without condition and with the particular steadiness of something that had decided, long before she arrived, that it was hers. The news reached Harlow County the way most news reached it, not through a single announcement, but through an accumulation of signals that the community read the way farmers read weather. A vehicle unfamiliar to the road, a delivery that required a signature, a conversation at the general store that paused when someone unfamiliar walked in. By the time anything official was said publicly, most people had already assembled a rough version of the truth from the fragments around them. And what they had assembled was close enough to accurate that the details, when they came, felt less like revelations than confirmations. The Historic Preservation designation was what made it official. When the state office issued its public notice regarding the Callahan Hargreave property and its newly cataloged materials of historical significance, the language was bureaucratic and deliberately restrained. But bureaucratic language, in a county where very little bureaucratic language was ever issued about anything, had its own kind of volume. People read it. People talked about it. And gradually, in the particular way that small communities process information they find significant, they began to understand that the woman who had moved into Raymond Callahan's old farmhouse with her daughter and her toolbox and her quiet determination to fix what needed fixing had found something beneath the floor that none of them had known was there. Nora was at the hardware store when Ed, who had helped her prioritize her repair list in the early weeks, set down the box of hinges he had been sorting and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the brisk practicality of a man helping a customer, but something more considered, more personal. "I heard about the property," he said. "Some of it is public now," she said. He nodded slowly. Raymond was a quiet man. She agreed. Ed looked at the hinges in his hand for a moment. He used to come in here. Not often, but when he did, he'd ask the right questions. Knew exactly what he needed. He set the hinges down. I always thought there was more going on with him than showed. Nora said she thought he was probably right about that. She had these conversations with some regularity now. They came at unpredictable moments at the school pickup line, at the library, at the diner 2 towns over where she had once sat with her notes and her yellow legal pad. People did not always know exactly what to say, but they found their way to something, and what they found was almost always genuine. Harlow County was not a place that did things for show. Its curiosity was real, its respect was real, and the slight bewilderment that accompanied both the sense that the ordinary-looking woman who had moved into the old farmhouse had turned out to be something other than ordinary was real too. What she noticed in those conversations was the absence of a particular kind of reaction. Nobody said they had always known something special would happen. Nobody claimed an early recognition of her potential that they had somehow failed to mention at the time. The people of Harlow County, by and large, responded to the discovery the way they responded to most things that happened on other people's land, with genuine interest, with the restraint of people who understood that other people's business was other people's business, and with a quiet respect for the fact that she had done it right. This was not universally the case elsewhere. Dana called from the dry cleaning shop. The conversation began warmly enough. Dana was genuinely glad, her pleasure in Nora's situation real and uncomplicated. But it moved, eventually, to the thing Dana had said that Nora had not forgotten and Dana had not mentioned since. You can't just move to the middle of nowhere with a 6-year-old. "I was wrong about that," Dana said. It came out easily, without the preamble of someone building toward an admission. Just the admission itself, clean. "You were being sensible," Nora said. "The sensible position was yours." "The sensible position was wrong," Dana said. "I'm noting that for the record." They talked for another hour. Dana was thinking about leaving the shop, had been thinking about it for years. She said, the way you thought about things you wanted and weren't sure you had the right to want. Nora listened to her the way she listened to most things, with full attention and without rushing to the answer. At the end of the conversation, Dana said, "You always made it look easier than it was." And Nora said, "It wasn't easy." And Dana said, "I know. That's what I mean." Rachel came to visit in the late winter, driving up from her house 4 states away with her 2 kids in the back seat and a bottle of wine she had been keeping for a specific occasion and had been uncertain for 3 years what that occasion would be. She arrived in the early evening, the kids spilling out of the car and immediately gravitating toward Lily and then toward the dog, who accepted the attention with the stoicism of an animal that had already made peace with being universally beloved. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment after the kids ran into the yard, not speaking, just looking at the walls Nora had painted and the curtains she had sewn and the table from the apartment with its years of marks, now sitting in a kitchen that was wide enough to hold it properly. She looked at all of it with the particular expression of someone who is comparing what they see to what they imagined and finding that the reality is better. "It's a good house," she said finally. Raymond said that, Nora told her. Rachel turned and looked at her. In the letter. They opened the wine and sat at the table and talked until the kids came back in and demanded dinner, and the evening became what evenings were: food and noise and the specific small chaos of children who were comfortable enough in a space to be completely themselves in it. Lily and Rachel's kids disappeared after dinner into Lily's room, and the sound of their argument about the rules of the card game they had invented drifted through the wall, and Nora and Rachel sat with the last of the wine and did not need to say very much, which was the best kind of conversation. Before Rachel left the following morning, she stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at the floor. The boards over the shaft had been replaced, properly fitted back into the seams with the care of someone who understood that a thing could be known without being constantly visible. There was nothing to see that would have told a stranger anything. Just a small room with a dense floor and a high window and the faint smell of old wood. "He knew," Rachel said. "Not a question." "The whole time," Nora said. Rachel looked at the floor for another moment. Then she turned and walked back down the hallway toward the kitchen, and Nora followed, and the door to the small room was left open behind them, the way doors were left open in a house where there were no longer any secrets that needed keeping. The conversation she had not expected, and that turned out to matter more than most of the others, happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March, in the parking lot of the county elementary school, at the end of a week that had been full of the specific administrative intensity that followed the conclusion of the legal processes. She was waiting for Lily's class to come out when a woman she vaguely recognized from school events stopped beside her. Her name was Carol, and she had a son in Lily's class, a quiet boy whose name Nora could never quite hold on to. Carol was the kind of person who expressed opinions with the confidence of someone who had never had occasion to seriously revise them, and Nora had encountered her twice before in the context of school events and had formed, on those occasions, the general impression of a person who was not unkind, but who moved through the world with a certainty that left little room for the unexpected. Carol had heard about the property. She wanted Nora to know, she said, that she thought it was wonderful. She said this with the warmth of someone giving a compliment that they considered generous. And then she said, "Though I have to say, when I first heard you'd bought that old Callahan place, I did wonder what on earth you were thinking." She said this with a small laugh, the kind that was meant to soften the statement by framing it as retrospective humor. Nora recognized the laugh. She had encountered its various forms throughout her life, the laugh that said, "I had doubts, but I am now repositioning those doubts as charming evidence of my own fallibility, now that the outcome has made doubt seem safe to admit." Nora looked at her for a moment. She was not angry. She had spent enough of her life managing the gap between what people said and what they meant to have lost the capacity for simple anger at it. What she felt was something more specific, a mild, clear recognition of the pattern, and a mild, clear decision about how to respond to it. "I was thinking it was my house," she said, "and that Lily needed a backyard." Carol nodded, absorbing this. "Well," she said, "it all worked out beautifully." "It did," Nora agreed. The kids came out then, and the conversation ended in the ordinary way of conversations at school pickup, swallowed by the noise and movement of children being released into the afternoon. Lily appeared with her backpack and her strong opinions about what had happened at lunch and her immediate identification of the dog, who was in the back seat and who she greeted with the enthusiasm of someone who had been separated from him for an unbearable 7 hours. Nora drove home through the county roads and thought about Carol's laugh and about what it represented and about whether it mattered. She thought about the 4 years that had preceded the move to Harlow County, the careful arithmetic, the tight margins, the decisions made without cushion, the particular exhaustion of a life that required constant vigilance to maintain. She thought about the people during that time who had expressed concern in the specific way that concern sometimes expressed itself as a form of low-level doubt, a gentle suggestion that the situation you were managing was beyond your capacity to manage. She had not forgotten any of it. She was not the kind of person who forgot things. But she had discovered, in the months since the discovery, that the desire for vindication for the moment where the doubters were confronted with the evidence of their error was less powerful than she had expected it to be. Not because it wasn't real, but because the life she was living had made it unnecessary. The house, the repaired fence, the dog at the foot of Lily's bed, the settled, unhurried certainty of a person who no longer had to calculate every decision against an edge. That was the vindication, and it was not directed at anyone. It was simply her life, and it was good, and the people who had doubted her were welcome to observe it and draw whatever conclusions seemed appropriate to them. This was not grace exactly. It was something more practical, the recognition that the energy you required to want acknowledgement from people who hadn't believed in you was energy that could be spent on better things. She had a list of better things. It was long and getting longer. The descendant conversations were the ones she thought about most in the months that followed. She was not present for them. Daniel Voss handled those meetings, with Professor Marsh available for historical context, but she received briefings afterward, and the briefings had a quality to them that she found difficult to fully describe but impossible to dismiss. 3 families, 3 different histories, 3 different ways that a gap in the record had been lived with, rationalized, absorbed into the family story without being resolved. The first family had known something was missing. There were old stories, handed down with the vagueness of things half understood, about an ancestor who had been a man of substance and had vanished from the historical record in the early 1940s in ways that didn't add up. They had attributed it, over generations, to the chaos of the period. When Daniel Voss contacted them, they'd been cautious the history of such contacts was not uniformly good, and then, as the documentation was shared, they had become something else. Nora received the briefing and thought about what it meant to have a gap in your story filled in not necessarily with a happy explanation, but with a true one. The ancestor had not simply disappeared. He had placed his assets in trust with a man he believed could keep them safe, and he had not survived to reclaim them. The trust had been kept. The assets had waited. And now, nearly a century later, the gap had a shape. The second family had no stories at all. The connection to the chamber's contents was 2 generations removed from anyone still living, and the documentation that established it was archival rather than familial. They received the news with a bewilderment that was genuine, and that took time to become something else. Professor Marsh described their response to Nora as the particular vertigo of people who had not known they were missing something and then discovered they were. The third family was the one that stayed with her. A woman in her 70s, the last of her line, who had spent her professional life as a schoolteacher and who received the news sitting in the kitchen of a small house not entirely unlike the farmhouse in Harlow County, with the same quality of worn-in domesticity that spoke of a life lived rather than curated. She had known for decades, through a combination of family oral history and her own quiet research, that something connected to her grandfather's business life had been held somewhere, by someone, for reasons she had never been able to fully trace. She had not pursued it seriously because the research kept leading to walls, and she had reached an age where walls were less interesting than the life available on this side of them. When Daniel Voss called her, she had listened to everything he said. Then she had asked one question. Was it intact? He had confirmed that it was. She had been quiet for a long time. Then she had said, somebody kept it safe. Daniel Voss told her yes. For 60 years. She had asked about Raymond Callahan. He had told her what he knew, which was what Nora had told him and what the documents in the small room had revealed. The woman had listened to all of it, and then she had said something that Daniel Voss quoted to Nora in the briefing, word for word, because he had written it down immediately and he thought she would want to know. She said, "Tell the woman who found it that my grandfather trusted the right person, and so did the man who kept it." Nora read that sentence in Daniel Voss's briefing notes and sat with it for a long time. She thought about the chain of it, Elias Hargreave, to Raymond Callahan to her, and about what it meant for trust to travel across a century and still arrive intact. She thought about the $5 bill and the painted horse and the long, specific silence of a man who had understood his responsibility and honored it completely and had found, at the end of his life, the person to hand it to. She thought about what it meant to be in that chain, to be the person at the end of it. Not the most important link, Raymond, was that the man who had carried it the longest, who had maintained the trust through 6 decades of ordinary days, but the link that closed it. That brought it to resolution. She had not expected to feel the weight of it as much as she did. She had expected the weight of the discovery, the weight of the process, the weight of the numbers. She had not expected the weight of being the conclusion of something that other people had started long before her and had not lived to see finished. It was, she found, a different kind of responsibility than the practical ones. It was not something she could address with a repair list or a legal process or a certified document. It was something she carried, quietly, in the same place she carried the memory of Raymond's kitchen and the painted horse and the particular sound of the school bus on the county road. Spring came fully to Harlow County, and with it the busy season that farmers knew and that Nora, now in her 2nd year on the property, was beginning to know in her own way. She was not a farmer. She had no intention of becoming one. But the 4 acres had their own rhythms that she had learned to read, the way the soil along the eastern boundary changed composition after the snowmelt, the way the treeline at the north end filtered the morning light differently as the leaves came in, the way the dry stream bed filled for a week in late March with the particular cold brown water of snow melt, and then emptied again as if it had never been there. She had planted a garden, not a large one, a long bed along the south side of the house, in soil that turned out to be better than she had expected. Tomatoes, peppers, a section of herbs, and at Lily's specific and non-negotiable request, sunflowers. Lily had planted the sunflowers herself. Pressing each seed into the soil with a focused deliberation she brought to important tasks, and she monitored their progress with a scientific interest that she extended also to the earthworms that appeared in the disturbed soil, which she named and then was persuaded to release. Professor Marsh came back in the spring, not in any official capacity, but simply as a visitor, because she had found, she said, that she thought about the farmhouse and the chamber and the people connected to them more than she thought about most of the cases she had worked in her career, and she wanted to see the place in a different season. She and Nora walked the 4 acres on a clear May afternoon, the professor in practical boots that suggested she had spent time on uneven ground before, and they talked not about the discovery, but about other things, the history of the county, the nature of trust as a historical force, the way places accumulated meaning that was not visible in the physical structure, but was present nonetheless, detectable by the right kind of attention. At one point, they stopped at the dry stream bed along the eastern boundary and stood looking at it in companionable silence, the water low now but still present, catching the afternoon light in its slow movement. "He chose well," Professor Marsh said, without specifying who she meant. Nora understood who she meant. "I've been thinking about that," Nora said, "about what he saw. I was very small when he knew me." "Children are not small in the ways that matter," Professor Marsh said. She looked at the water for another moment. "You listened. You came here for the right reasons. And when you found it, you did the right things in the right order." She glanced at Nora. "That is not as common as it should be." Nora thought about the yellow legal pad and the careful notes and the call to Rachel and then Daniel Voss and then Walt's assessment and then Dr. Osei and then Professor Marsh herself, each step placed deliberately before the next. The whole thing built the way you built anything that needed to hold weight from the foundation up without rushing. "I just did what made sense," she said. "Yes," Professor Marsh said. "That's what I mean." They walked back toward the house through the late afternoon light. the professor asking about the garden, and Nora describing Lily's sunflower project with the particular warmth of a parent whose child has committed to something with complete conviction. The dog appeared from somewhere in the field to the north, tail working, muddy at the paws, and fell in a step beside them with the satisfaction of an animal that had correctly identified its people. Lily was on the porch when they came around the side of the house. She was drawing, bent over a sketchbook with the intensity she brought to things that mattered, and she looked up when she heard them coming and registered Professor Marsh with the comfortable recognition of a child who had met someone enough times to have a clear position on them. "I'm doing the chamber," Lily said, holding up the sketchbook. The drawing showed the shaft and the ladder and the arching ceiling of the main space, rendered in colored pencil with a thoroughness that went well beyond what Lily had ever been told about the chamber specifics. Nora looked at the drawing. "You've never been down there," she said. "I know what it looks like," Lily said, with complete confidence. Professor Marsh looked at the drawing for a long moment. "That's quite accurate," she said. Lily nodded, accepting this as the confirmation it was, and went back to her drawing. Nora stood on the porch of her house in the late spring light and watched Professor Marsh look at her daughter's drawing of the chamber beneath the small room. And she thought about the word accurate and what it meant in the context of a 6-year-old who had never descended a ladder into a concrete vault, but who had pressed her foot against the floor and heard something on the very first day that the adults around her had needed weeks and specialists and equipment to fully understand. She thought about listening, about what it meant to be the kind of person who heard things that were not being announced, who noticed what was present without needing it to identify itself. She thought about Raymond, who had watched a small girl listen and had made a decision that lasted 30 years. She thought about Lily, who had done the same thing at 6.5, in pink boots, on a cold Saturday in a strange house, with the patience of someone who had always understood that the most important things were the ones that didn't make noise. She was raising that child, was responsible every day for the conditions in which that particular quality, that listening, that patient attention would either develop or diminish. She had always taken that responsibility seriously. It felt now even more significant than it had before, not because the stakes were higher in any material sense, but because she understood more clearly what the quality was worth, what it could find if given the right circumstances and the space to work. The afternoon light shifted on the porch, and the dog settled at her feet, and Lily turned a page in her sketchbook and began something new, and Professor Marsh said she should probably get back on the road before the light went entirely, and they said their goodbyes the way people said them when they expected to see each other again, which was without ceremony and with the ease of an ongoing thing. And then it was just Nora and Lily on the porch of the farmhouse in Harlow County in the long spring evening, with the fields going quiet and the tree-line going dark at the north end of the property and the dry stream bed catching the last of the light along the eastern boundary, and the house behind them holding everything it had always held and some things that had only recently been given the repaired roof, the level porch, the painted walls, the curtains in the kitchen and beneath the floor of the small room at the back of the hall, the sealed shaft and the chamber, and the small room behind the secondary door with its desk and its cot frame and its empty shelf, from which the tin box and its coins had been removed and carefully secured, and which now held, instead, the small painted horse that Nora had placed there on the day the legal processes concluded, because it seemed right that Raymond's room should have something of his in it, and because the painted horse was the beginning of everything, and beginnings deserved to be honored. Lily had not commented on the horse's relocation. She had simply registered it when Nora told her, nodded with her characteristic serious acceptance, and said, "It's a good place for it," which was, Nora had thought, exactly right. The evening came down fully. The first stars appeared. Lily packed up her sketchbook and went inside to help with dinner, which was what she did now, set the table, filled the water glasses, asked questions about everything that had happened during the day, narrated everything that had happened during hers in the detailed and nonlinear fashion of a person for whom all details were equally important until demonstrated otherwise. Nora stood on the porch for one more minute, in the dark and the spring air, looking at the stars over Harlow County. She thought about a morning 4 years ago when she had stood in the break room of a dry cleaning shop eating half a sandwich she had packed because lunch was no longer something she allowed herself to buy, under a fluorescent light that had been flickering for 3 weeks. She thought about the specific quality of that moment, not the drama of it, because there was no drama, only the low, persistent pressure of a life operating too close to its edge, and she thought about the distance between that moment and this one. It was not a small distance. It was not a distance that could be measured in any single dimension. It was the distance between two entirely different relationships to the future one in which the future was a problem to be managed, a thing that required constant vigilance and offered no certainty, and one in which the future was something else. Not guaranteed, not simple, but spacious. Room enough in it for mistakes and recoveries. Room enough for Lily to grow up without the background hum of her mother's calculations. Room enough for a garden with sunflowers and a dog that slept at the foot of the bed in a house that was entirely, fully, completely theirs. She went inside. The door closed behind her, and the farmhouse received her, and the night settled over Harlow County the way it always did, completely. Without hurry, over fields and fence lines and dry stream beds and 4 acres of land that had given everything it had and asked for nothing in return except to be known. There was one more thing that happened that spring, and it was small enough that Nora almost missed it, which was exactly the kind of thing Raymond would have appreciated. Gerald Marsh, the estate lawyer, the one with the voice like old furniture, called on a Wednesday morning in April. He called not about any remaining legal matter, all of which had been handled, but about something he said had been nagging at him since the conclusion of the estate process, and that he felt, after some deliberation, he should share. When Raymond Callahan had instructed him on the terms of the bequest, the transfer of the farmhouse to Nora, he had included one piece of guidance that Gerald Marsh had noted but had not understood at the time, and had not thought to mention until now, because it had seemed, in the context of a straightforward property transfer, like an eccentricity rather than an instruction. Raymond had said, "If she asks why me, tell her she bought the horse." Gerald Marsh had written it down because he wrote down everything, and he had noted it as the kind of remark elderly clients sometimes made that had meaning to them without requiring explanation for anyone else. He had not mentioned it at their first meeting because Nora had not asked that question, and he had not mentioned it since because the extraordinary nature of what had followed had made it seem like a footnote. But it had stayed with him, he said, and he thought she should have it. She thanked him and ended the call and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. If she asks why me, tell her she bought the horse. She had bought the horse because Raymond had put a $5 bill in her hand and told her to buy something she actually wanted, not something useful. And she had wanted the horse not for any practical reason, not because it would help her or sustain her or make anything easier, but because it was beautiful and it was hers, and those were sufficient reasons. And she had kept it for 30 years on various windowsills, through the apartment and the marriage and the years after, and she had carried it in her lap for the 2-hour drive to Harlow County because it was the one object she had been most careful with during the move. He had known, from the moment he put that bill in her hand, that she was the kind of person who kept the horse. She got up from the table and walked down the hallway to the small room and looked at the floor. She thought about the chain of it, the whole long chain, the girl with the $5 bill, the woman with the repair list, the farmhouse with its dense floor, the shaft, the chamber, the letter, the tin box, the painted horse now on the shelf in the small room behind the secondary door, holding the beginning of the story in the place where its conclusion had been reached. She thought about Raymond watching her from whatever position the dead occupied relative to the living. She thought he would be satisfied. Not surprised she didn't think he had ever allowed himself surprise about her, but satisfied. The quiet satisfaction of someone who had placed a careful bet and lived long enough, or long enough in some sense, to see it pay. She stood in the small room for a little while, and then she went back to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water and looked out the window above the sink at the south-facing garden bed, where Lily's sunflowers were already coming up, bold and unhurried, turning their young faces toward the light the way things did when they had been planted in good ground by someone who knew how to listen. Outside, the county road was empty. The fields were wide and quiet, and beginning to show the first green of the season. The tree line at the north end of the property stood patient and familiar against the sky. The farmhouse held everything it had always held and would continue to hold history and secrets, decisions, and their consequences, the long accumulated weight of what people trusted to each other and what endured. Nora drank her water. She put the glass in the sink. She picked up her phone and called her sister because it was Wednesday, and that was when they talked. And the ordinary rhythms of life were what you returned to when the extraordinary was finished, not because they were less important, but because they were the thing that made everything else possible. The structure, the foundation, the ground that the rest of it grew from. Rachel picked up on the second ring. "How's the garden?" she asked. "The sunflowers are up," Nora said. "Lily will be insufferable." "She already is," Nora said. "It's wonderful." And they talked, the two of them, in the kitchen of a farmhouse in Harlow County on a Wednesday afternoon in April, about sunflowers and road trips, and a book they were both finally reading, and the dog's evolving relationship with the concept of the fence, and the world outside the window was green and wide and unhurried, and the house around them was sound, and the future was spacious, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be found had been found. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.